Astronauts to the moon.
Ignition sequence start. 3, 2, 1.
Houston, we have a problem.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue.
What you're seeing here is a mirage.
What's going on, everyone? It's Jeranism back with a live video for you today. Thanks, as always, for joining me. I appreciate it a ton. Hello to everyone in the chat. Hello to those at home or in your car or wherever you might be. Grab a seat, get comfortable. It's time to talk about our history. So an interesting subject for sure, but also a very sensitive one and one of huge importance. So one thing that I found very interesting about this subject is it's so sensitive that people often get very upset when you question it. And so I just wanted to remind everybody listening to please have an open mind. Please don't dismiss things right off the bat. You need to do your own research. You need to look into what we're saying. You need to do your own back fact checking. But it's also something that needs to be questioned, because even if you look as early as, say, 1850, anything that came out of Washington as news would simply be whatever they told the guy on the horse to ride back and tell everybody else. So it would have been very easy to fabricate our history at many points throughout time. And if you look at just what's happened recently, that with the media being controlled and owned, that it's very easy for them even now to fabricate our history. So just keep an open mind. It is definitely going to be a shocking little conversation. Joining me today is Clint Wayland. And Clint, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm here.
Good. And I'm just going to double check and make sure that everyone can hear me okay. So if somebody in the chat can just give me a okay that you can hear us both before I can continue on and make a mockery of you guys not being able to hear me. So we're going to make sure that that's all heard, and then we'll get going. Let's see here. Let's make sure everyone can hear us both. I don't see anything yet, but should be here soon. Usually it's about 15 seconds behind or so. But we won't move on until we get an okay. And anybody, do we sound good? Can you hear us both? Well, I guess that's probably a yes. Good sound. All right. Thank you, Jason. Appreciate that. Okay, good. Glad you guys can hear us okay. And Clint, why don't you tell me or tell everybody, and I'll just say how we met real quick. We have exchanged emails a few times, and that probably started, 2 years ago. And you'd heard me talk about my opinions of history, and you had the same kind of opinions. And then also we found out that both of us were reading, or I think you had read it, and I was in the middle of reading Antoni Fomenko's work. It's called The New Chronology. He's got quite a few books. I think it's a 7-book set or 6-book set. I'll show that here in a second for everyone to see. But
Right.
Why don't you just tell everybody, how you've come into this information and what your opinion is of history.
Sure. Okay, well, it was about 2 years ago, and like I said, I emailed you regarding the history, and a little bit about me is, I'm from Oklahoma, small town Oklahoma, and ever since I was about 11 years old, I've questioned history. I've looked into history. I've been studying medieval history since about 11 years old. In fact, when I was 11, I checked out a book that was meant for a high school grade level that was about the Crusades. And so I've been researching that material for many years. And what I've come across is that history doesn't seem logical, and it doesn't match what we look at today. It doesn't seem to correspond with the natural flow of what history really should be. And if anything didn't make any sense to me, I always questioned it. And so basically I started questioning history, and then I grew up, went to college, but my research didn't stop. I still continued to research the medieval history and history of not just the medieval history, but the history of England, history of Rome, the Crusades, and church history as well.
Good, yeah, and I've kind of looked into some of the same things, and people know my story as far as selling books, and that's what really got me on my, look into history and when these books were written and who wrote them and why they were all rewritten. Where's the originals? Where's the and I think if Flamenco believes that the oldest verifiable text that we can go to is about 1100. Is that what he says?
I believe so. Yeah, you can't go back any further than that. Although he did mention the 3 codices of the Old Testament, the Bible, that go back to the 9th century. But other than that, there's no other manuscripts that he mentions or codices that he mentions that goes back any further than that.
Correct. Yeah, and what we want to do is we're going to kind of step through this, starting off with the what's called the Scaligerian chronology, which if people don't know what that is, we'll tell you here shortly, but it's kind of the chronology that we all go by now. And then we're going to get into some of the church history, the Roman history, talking about why that doesn't work and what we think possibly is the reason for that. We want to get into the Crusades and talk about that and what year that supposedly happened versus what year it probably happened. We want to talk about Jerusalem and the problems with modern day Jerusalem, and then get into English history and why the Anglo-Saxon chronicles seem to only date back to 400 years ago or so. So we'll kind of cover that all, and if it's something that you guys want us to cover more of, we can do that. But today will just be kind of a topical, but at the same time we'll get through it. I did have a couple quotes just about history to read real quick. Of course, the one that I'm sure everyone has at some time or another heard, which is, one second, make sure you're reading the same script I am, is the one from Napoleon Bonaparte, which says, history is a set of lies agreed upon. And if you just think about that, that is probably very true. This one here is interesting. It's history is a lie. Religion is a control system. Money is a hoax. Debt is a fiction. Media is manipulation. Government is a corporation, and the system is a lie. Many people have also heard the Adolf Hitler quote, make the lie big, make it simple, keep saying it, and eventually they will believe it. And also, finally, we have Mark Twain, who said, history is strewn thick with evidence that a truth is not hard to kill, but a lie, well told, is immortal. And that's, one of my favorite quotes about history. Before we get too much into that, I just wanted to ask you, are you also a believer? Have you been looking into the shape of the earth? Are you a believer in the flat earth theory? Are you a globe skeptic?
Oh, yeah. My flat earth interest started about 5-6 years ago, and I found Matt Boylan's website, where he talks about how he was once working for NASA. And, I watched his videos, and I thought, wow, this makes a lot of sense. And I had questioned everything else up to that point except that. But then after he proved that you could, make a painting and you really can't tell the difference between a painting and a photo, that really struck me. And I think that's really what got me started with watching flat earth videos and going along with a lot of the interests and concerns of the flat earth movement.
Yeah, and I think anybody who, a lot of people ask me all the time, what's your number one reason the earth is flat? And, I always say it's my whole entire video selection, or it's my whole entire body of research that has led me to that. And one of the main things is the idea of history. So if you haven't looked into history yet, then it's no surprise to me that you would have issues with the idea of a flat earth, because if history is as we're told, well, then there's not a lot of questions about the shape of the earth. The problem becomes, if we've got books that have been rewritten in 1600, and we've got timelines that have been redrawn in 1600, and we've kind of got a reorganizing of thoughts and a reorganizing of minds, and on top of that, we've got the installation of the type press, or being able to mass produce books. And when you combine all that together, all of a sudden it kind of can tell you why something the size of what we've been talking about in the flat earth world is certainly possible. Because when you've gotten books that have all been rewritten and you've been able to mass produce them, really it's about getting that through to one generation, getting the new story out to one group of people, and they become your teachers, and then they become the professors, and you've kind of in one fatal swoop introduced this lie to the world. And that's what really, when we get into this, you'll see how it's highly possible. And there's not a lot that we can go on as far as our history. And a lot of people think that history is pretty much set in stone, and we'll also go through some of that. There's so much dissension in the ranks and disagreements about everything in history because it's such a disaster. It's such a mess. It's hard to follow. People show up numerous times in history. There's also references to people at the wrong time, people who are referencing people in books that are dead, people, not mentioning others that they absolutely should. One of those I've talked a lot about is Aristophanes, who was from Alexandria. He was supposedly the librarian there. And there's people that came after, there's people that came after him that were from the same city and talking about the same subjects that never mention his name once. And those kind of things are impossible. Those things just would not happen. And so that's why I'm able to just dismiss stories like the Aristophanes story. And a lot of it just doesn't make sense. And so we're going to talk about that. To start out, why don't you kind of give people an idea of what the Scaligerian chronology is? And I'll kind of bring that up on a website here so we can kind of show it.
Okay. So Josephus Justus Scaliger, who lived from 1440 to 1609, and he was called the founder of modern chronology. His principal works are the Opus Novium de Imitationem, I really can't pronounce that, Temporum, and that was Paris of 1583, the Sacrum Temporum, which was 1606, and the De Doctrina Temporum, Paris, 1627. And then it's believed that the foundations of what he discovered in his chronology were laid by Eusebius, Pamphilus, and Saint Hymenaeus. I'm not going to pronounce that right. Honymus.
Thank you, Time.
Allegedly in the 4th century.
Yeah.
Honymus.
Something interesting just from the right when you get to his Wikipedia. It says, was a French religious leader and scholar known for expanding the notion of classical history from Greek and ancient Roman history to include Persian, Babylonian, Jewish, and ancient Egyptian history. So, I mean, that right there is something that people need to look at, and that should call into question, like, what are you talking about? What do you mean he's known for expanding the notion of classical history? And so we'll talk about that, but go ahead and continue on from there.
Okay, well, Joseph Scaliger got the information that he used from Eusebius, and Eusebius of Caesarea, he was basically the one who put together a chronology based on the dating of Genesis in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And this dating, or since Adam, actually. And so what you've got here is the problem that every nation had their own dating of the time from the dating of the history of Genesis, and so basically they thought, well, some of them thought it was 5489. One of them thought maybe it was 6403, and these dates were basically what he used to date the history. And that's where we get the problem, is because these dates are way off, and they probably didn't even, have anything to do with real history. And so Eusebius published his works in 1544, or his works were published in 1544. And it's assumed that the Scaligerian chronology was based on the interpretations of the assorted numeric data that was collected from the Bible. And then, so Joseph Scaliger attempted to reconstruct the entire tractate of Eusebius. And so that's where basically the problems come from. And then there's other problems, such as the fact that most of the history that we know of, the dating of our current calendar, is based off a particular ruler, or it could be based off of a time that the founding of a specific city was founded, or a date. So, in other words, like if it wasn't a Christian country which used the dating for the Genesis, which Joseph Scaliger used, then they probably went by the founding of their city, or the founding of the ruler when that ruler was born. They didn't have a specific. They didn't all use the same dating system. And an example of that is Russia. Russia right now doesn't use, or they hadn't used for a long time, the calendar, the Julian calendar. So that's kind of a history of Joseph Scaliger and how he came up with some of his dating methods.
Right, and one thing that I always like to point out is just to really think about, if we were to, at this point in history, or at this point in life, go back in time and to set a zero date to a certain point, that a lot of that should call into question exactly what went on. Just to think of that we went back in time, set a zero date, and said anything before that we're going to count negative, anything after that we're going to count positive. It's just not something that would be done, especially as late as they did it. It's just something that sounds crazy. And again, I went looking for books written by Ptolemy, and these are the guys I wanted to see, when did they write this stuff. And when I went looking, you can't find the date that they actually wrote it. Now, you can find the date that coincides with our current dating system, but I was looking for, when did they say they wrote it? Because if Ptolemy wrote it in 70 AD or whatever, then he must have written what the date was according to him. And a lot of these books, that has been eliminated. It's been rewritten and applied to our current dating system. And that was something that made me get real upset, because I said, well, how do we know any of this stuff is dated correctly? Somebody could have just dated this. And really, when you start looking through some of the writings, Lucretius and other people like that, they were writing way ahead of their time. If we're supposed to believe that stuff, then we also have to believe that humans are just stupid as it gets. Basically, he's giving the answers to different things like atoms and how things work, and how things are made up. And this was 1800 years before some of these things were even started to come out in
materialize.
Yeah. So I mean, it's ridiculous. And same thing when we go with Da Vinci and things like that. That he's drawing things that took him 400 or 500 years even to begin thinking about. It just doesn't work when you look at our history. So with the Scaliger dating, what year did they, or around what time did they apply that? And was it universal? Was it something that was picked up by everyone quickly, or how do you see that?
Well, his books, or his works, were written in 1583, 1606, 1627. So it was the 16th and 17th century whenever Joseph Scaliger wrote his chronology. So basically that means that anything that he wrote about, the history that he wrote about, was written in the 16th and 17th century. Right.
And so let's get into the second stuff. The second thing we wanted to talk about. So go ahead and start with that history, and we'll go back where you want to go back to. Greek and Roman times.
Sure. Well, Rome has a lot of problems. The one question that most historians have problems with is who founded Rome. Was it Aeneas or Aeneas and Ulysses, or was it Remus and Romulus? And Aristotle claims that the city of Rome was founded by Aeneas and Ulysses and received its name from the Trojan woman Rama. Okay? But Titus Livy wrote History of Rome, and he said that it was founded by Romulus and Remus. So that's just one problem that we've got with Rome. And it was founded in 753 BC, supposedly. And that's according to the Scaligerian timeline.
Right.
Then we got Titus Livy. This is another problem, who wrote the history of Rome and described Rome and its history, a whole 700-year period. But only 35 books survived of the original 144 books.
Mm-hmm.
The first publication of his history took place in 1469 and was based on a manuscript of unknown origin, which is currently lost. So that's the second problem. And then we've got the medieval historian Ferdinand Gregorovius, who says that Rome, when he supposedly visited Rome in the 15th century, and when he did, he said that it transformed into a monastery.
Mm-hmm.
He also said that the imperial forums have drowned into taciturnity. He says that the Forum of Augustus was encumbered with ruins to such an extent that it had many trees growing there. The trees were so many that the people used to call it the Enchanted Garden. This is Italian Rome we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You know, where with all of the monuments and the columns and the structures. Ferdinand Gregorovius says that the capital city had grown over with weeds so that the ruins were barely visible. And basically what Anatoly Fomenko says, the reason for that is because the ruins hadn't been built yet. There was nothing there.
Mm-hmm.
So Gregorovius stated that not a single monument of any Roman celebrity from the first part of the 13th century remained in Rome. He says the enormous ruins of the forums built by Augustus, Nerva, and Caesar have miraculously transformed into castle fortresses.
Right.
He writes that there is no proof that the castle fortresses had stood there for many centuries. Yeah, and so basically what happened is when these people read Joseph Scaliger's History of Rome, they thought, and since he put that history in current modern day Italy, Rome, Italy, they thought that they would find everything that he mentioned for Rome when they visited Rome. But they didn't. They didn't find anything.
Right.
There was no paper in antiquity, as we are told nowadays. The classics, of anything that was written down from that time frame, there was nothing. They couldn't find any books or anything in Rome when he visited. There was nothing there, and so then there's the problem of Tacitus. The history of Scaligerian chronology, the books of Tacitus, disappeared from sight for a long time, fell into oblivion, but they resurfaced again in the 14th and the 15th century,
right,
miraculously.
And we're missing for hundreds of years.
Right. And these, like I said, this is Titus Livy and Tacitus we're talking about. These were the writers of the history of Rome.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they were the ones. That's how we know about the Roman history.
Right.
Without these writers, we wouldn't know anything about the Roman history. Another writer is Plutarch. Plutarch was basically he was kind of a historian, but he was he was discovered by Francisco Petrarch, who sounds very similar to Plutarch. And Francisco Petrarch lived from 1304 to 1374. And Petrarch, when he visited Rome, was convinced that there should be many great buildings of ancient times in Rome, but he didn't find any.
Mm-hmm.
Just like Gregorovius, he couldn't find any building or monuments. Petrarch writes, "Where are the thermodialecticin Caracalla? Where is the Timbrium of Marius, the Septizonium of Service? Where is the Forum of Augustus, the Temple of Mars, the Avenger? Where are the places of Jupiter, the Thunder Barrier, on the Capitol and Apollo, or the Capitol and Apollo of the Palatine? Where is the Portico of Libya and the Theater of Marcellus? Where are the temples of Hercules and the Muses built by Marius Philip, and the Temple of Diana built by Lucius Cornelius?" See, these are really popular structures that should have been there.
Right.
But none of these were there when he visited Italian Rome. And so he searched for statues, collected Roman medals, and tried to recreate the history of Rome again, because there was no history.
And what year is
Petrarch,
that? What year is that he went in searching for those things?
That was in the 14th century, sometime around the 1370s.
Right.
He died in the 1370s. That was probably around 1350 something. So, but yeah, he visited Rome and there was nothing there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the same thing goes with Gregorovius when he visited Rome, and that was in the 15th century as well. That was about 100 years later, but still he didn't find anything. And so then you read about the next problem we have is the papal secretary Poggio Bracciolini. He received an inventory of a number of manuscripts that contains several minor works of Tacitus from a monk from Hursfield Abbey. Now we're told that he had the collection of all of the books of Tacitus and Titus Livy, and so, but problem is, where did he get those books? And he lived in 1425, so where did he come up with these books?
Mm-hmm.
If they were non-existent before? And so some authors named Hocart and Rose proclaim the history of Cornelius Tacitus to have actually been written in the 15th century, and they claim that Poggio Bracciolini wrote the history or forged it. Now, the reason they did is because he had a history of forgery, and there were some other manuscripts that he had forged that he'd been caught forging.
Right.
So that's another problem that we have with Rome, and that's a huge problem. To say that the letters and the history of Titus Livy and Tacitus were possibly forged. And then we got Plutarch, who was also a writer of Rome and the history of Rome, but the person who had his book, or had one of his books in collection, was a man named Francisco Petrarch, who sounds just like, if you put an L and a U in front of the name, you get Plutarch.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Petrarch was in the possession of a list of original works by Horace, Ovid, Catullus, Propertius, Tibullus, Perseus, Claudian, Ovid, comedians Plautus and Tertullius, the historians Titus Livy, Silistius, Eutropius, Justin, Valerius, Maximus, Quintilian, Varro, Pliny, Vitruvius. There's a whole list of these books that he had in his possession, and Plutarch. So, and he also had scribes working for him. He founded a workshop with scribes and secretaries. And according to some of the letters, Cicero, according to some of these letters that he had in his possession, Cicero was a knight and a troubadour.
Mm-hmm.
That makes him medieval, not Roman.
Right. Maybe we could talk. Maybe we could talk about some, figures that people might know of or have heard of that don't fit in the timeline that that they've been placed. I know I've done a lot of looking into Josephus's work from Antiquities of the Jews, and many people know about the Jesus input, which certainly seems like it's been placed into that writing, because if you just kind of read the Antiquities of the Jews, you'll see how detailed he is. Now, one of the interesting things is there that they never use dates, which has always bothered me. Because if you asked me to write you a story, I would write a story, and I probably wouldn't include any dates. But if you told me to write a history of my life, or a history of the last week, or what I did today, well, I'm going to have dates. That's how you write true history. So I've always found it a little bit weird that usually they'll describe it around the time of so-and-so, when so-and-so was in charge and was married to, that's how they describe it, which could have been that simply, hey, thank you, IPS. It could be simply that people back then didn't, go off the dates. They went more off of who was in charge. But I think also we would have a lot of instances of dates being input. So if people don't know, I'll just show you. This is in chapter, I believe it's book 20. I don't even know what book I'm in here. It's in book, what are we at? Book 18. And this is of Josephus's work. And just show you where the Jesus line is put in. You'll have a lot of people who will say this is proof that Jesus existed. And I'm not saying that he didn't, but I certainly wouldn't use this as my reason, because he's describing everything. He's describing it in detail, and then all of a sudden in this third paragraph here, you'll see it says, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had him condemned to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians so named for him are not extinct at this day." And then he moves on to completely different things. And so if you read him, you'll understand that this is not a paragraph that would be input into this writing, because he would not basically tell you that somebody rose from the dead, that somebody was God, that somebody was the Christ, and that they did 10,000 other wonderful things. It's just not, it doesn't belong in this story. And the interesting thing, have you looked into much about the whole idea of Isaides and Queen Helena? Have you followed that much?
I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, there was.
Are you talking about the?
Well, this is somebody that many people have probably heard of, Queen Helena. In fact, she's got some monuments to her. I think her burial pyramid is somewhere in Jerusalem or something. But basically, the problem that becomes is there's still a problem of who is she exactly, because it seems like she's been repeated in history. Also, if you go through and you read this, now I'm on book 20, Antiquities of the Jews, book 20, and you read through, you'll get to this place where it's talking about Isaides, and when you learn about Isaides, there's some interesting instances here that many people think that Isaides was, and you have to give me a chance to kind of explain this, that Isaides was a prototype for Christ, and the entire idea of the Shroud of Turin is actually a painting of Isaides. And what's really crazy about that is when you look into it, and I'm going to try and find it here where it is, that this is right out of the Bible. It's actually a mirrored story here when you talk about during the time Isaides abode, at Charax Spasini, a certain Jewish merchant whose name was Ananias. And if you read the Bible, this is straight out of the Bible here, this person's name. Got among them the women that belonged to the king and taught them to worship God according to the Jewish religion. And if you look into the story of the Shroud of Turin, that this is the guy's name, Ananias, that was the one who got that shroud of Jesus. And what's kind of crazy about this whole story is when you read further, you'll see that let's see, is it about here? Let's see. I'm just making sure I'm reading the right thing. She basically went to Jerusalem and was giving out lots of food and money. I'm talking about his mom, Helena, now. And they put up a monument to her. Well, if we go look up Queen Helena, you'll see that there's an issue, because what's going to happen is Queen Helena was also the mother of Constantine. And
Constantine, okay, that's where that came from. I knew that sounded familiar. Okay,
right, and it becomes a problem because they get them confused, and there's no differentiating factor besides the fact of 350 years. If you look at Isaides, and we'll bring him up real quick, and I'll just put Isaides here, which is Izates. When you bring up Isaides Bar Monobaz here, this is certainly interesting. Hey, thank you so much. You'll see here, Isaides' son Monobaz, interesting dates. He was born in 1 and died in 55. Isaides, or as Isis, as Josephus Flavius sometimes calls him, was the king of the Parthian client kingdom of Adabene, who became a proselyte to Judaism. He was the son of Queen Helena and King Monobaz. Queen Helena was also said to be the wife of King. And this is where we get into these questions where it's confusing. It already says she's the wife of this person, but she's also said to be the wife of this person, of Odessa, and thus the queen of Odessa too. And Odessa is where the shroud was, if I'm not mistaken. This implies that Isaides is the king of Edessa as well as Adabene, and therefore cognate either Manu V or Manu 6, Moses of Chorin. Sorry if I don't pronounce any of this stuff right. But if you kind of go through and follow this story, and I think there's a few people who have talked about it, that it certainly appears that this story is mirrored. It's a story that's mirrored. So is her life. And again, if we look up Helena, because she's got a couple monuments to herself, and let me look that up so I can show you what I mean. That and people get confused. They don't know which Helena. This is the Roman saint. But it's a different one, but it's the same. I mean, there's no differentiating things. It's the same stories told. Constantine's mom went to Jerusalem, did all these things. Well, there's a monument to her, but there's no way to tell which one. And I guess we could talk a little bit about the missing time theory, that people just simply wanted to be. For instance, I've heard the story that around the year 700 or 600 or something like that, that the people around at that time wanted to basically change the date so that they were around for a big festival. So they just just added 400 years. Because again, we're talking on such a local level, nobody would even know. You could just tell people, actually the date is 1000. How would they know the difference? They wouldn't know. So, right. But I'm thinking, I'm sure you have some other ones too. I've got a few. What's some other people that don't fit into the timeline that we've been given?
Well, there's quite a few, actually. Well, you've got Herodotus, who mentions some pharaohs who don't fit into the timeline, and that they are off like 1,800 years. Right. See if I can find that. I have some notes here. And
well, that's what's certainly interesting about the Egyptians and the timeline as far as that goes. Fomenko looked at it, and for those of you who are just tuning in or don't know what we're talking about, if you read Fomenko's stuff, and it's an excellent read, and the reason I like it so much is he's got facts and evidence on everything that he talks about. It's certainly more than you can find of our current history. He's actually done it with another guy. They were part of the Russian Academy of Sciences, who went and tried to redraw the chronology correctly, and in it found so many errors. That's why he wrote that 7-part book. But one of the things that he found was that it certainly seems like that maybe our history is a lot shorter, because when you look at people and different different clans, say the Greeks, and then you look at the Romans, and then you look at the Egyptians, our history tells them as if they each existed independently, meaning, or at separate times. Like the Greeks existed, but nobody else in the world existed. And then the Egyptians existed, and nobody else existed. And then here comes the Romans, and nobody else existed. Well, we simply know that isn't, quite true. So when you start to redraw, what he realizes that he thinks that they pulled people out. For instance, let's say there's the Greek group. Well, instead of describing them in the times that they existed with everyone else existing at the same time, they pulled them out and gave them like a separate section of time. And what that did is draw out our history to a much longer period of time, when really everything could have been around the same time. In fact, I think Fomenko believes that the pyramids could be a recent thing, and that the pharaohs were as recent as, what does he think, 1700?
Right. He thinks that the pharaohs lived in about the Middle Ages, actually. That would have been the 1200s to the 1500s, somewhere around that time. Yeah.
Right. And again, a lot of people might think that we have got a lot of information to go off of as far as when the Egyptian pharaohs existed, and we don't. We don't have any of that information. In fact, a couple pieces of papyrus, and again, you can't date things like that. You can only date them based on their writing style and the paper that they used, and that's how we date things like that. And so it'd be very easy to put people and put kingdoms and places where they shouldn't be.
Right.
So you said you had
something.
Well,
you mentioned. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, you mentioned you wanted me to list someone that doesn't fit into the time period.
Right.
Herodotus, the Greek teacher, called Cheops the successor of Ramses II.
Mm-hmm.
But that would mean that there's 1,200 years in between the time of Cheops and Ramses II. There's a 1,200-year error there, because Ramses was a king of the 19th dynasty, 1345 to 1200 BC, and Cheops belonged to the 2600 2480 BC time period. And this is called history by Herodotus. So
right, and a lot of the history is based on things that he said.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's other parts of history that he says that a pharaoh succeeded another pharaoh, but he leaps forward to the end of the fourth dynasty. I think it was Axius was succeeded by Anesus. But that doesn't make any sense, because
there's also go ahead.
That's a 1800-year error.
Right, and if you start going through the history, the amount of 100 and 200-year errors are uncountable. Off the top of my head, I can't think of a few, but Pythagoras, I know that Pythagoras was a friend of somebody who died at least 100 years before he was born, and is said numerous times to be a friend and a teacher or a student of his, and there's no way that they existed. Right, and there's no way that they existed anywhere close to each other. I think the years are off by 150. So that's one that I can think of. I didn't have any notes, but I know there's quite a few more. And these are all kind of an example of either somebody got the dating wrong, or these people were, it was like a setup. It was not a setup, but it's a story that is being told. But you can imagine if you have a bunch of people, let's say, that lived over the course of 400 or 500 years, and you're trying to spread them out, you're going to make mistakes. And that's what it certainly seems like happened, is that this is not a true telling of history where you wouldn't have these mistakes. For instance, nobody's going to say that George Washington was friends with Martin Luther King. It's just not going to happen because we are telling a history of, time as it goes on. But imagine if we were going to take the people that have lived in the last 400 years and spread them out to make it a 2,000-year history, that you could make mistakes like that. You could accidentally say that two people that were not around at the same time were friends, or that they knew each other, And so when Fomenko starts going through these things, then he's able to pull out these mistakes. And when he starts looking at the mistakes, you can find correlations and connections with them. And he was able to redraw the chronology.
Right. And yeah, but the one thing, like you said, that doesn't fit in the timeline are, certain kings. Like, let me give you an example. The Egyptian pharaohs, according to the Universal, I forget what that was, the Universal Catalog, I believe is what it's called.
Mm-hmm.
It shows these Egyptian pharaohs, and they look like Christian kings from the medieval time frame. They're holding the scepters, they're holding the orbs.
Right.
I wish I had a picture I could send to you on that, but I believe it's on page. Let's see if I got that marked here. It's in the chronology 1. I'm not exactly sure what page it is, but anyway, it does show that they're holding scepters and they're holding orbs, and these are pharaohs. These are Egyptian pharaohs, and they look like typical medieval kings from the Middle Ages. And an old. This is an old book that was written back in 1493, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So that right there told me that no, the chronology is way off. I don't know where they're getting these dynasties of these Egyptians.
And this isn't something either that's not questioned by mainstream historians, but it's kind of left alone because there's really, without changing the entire history, you just have to chalk it up to an error, mistake, an omission, or an addition. They're not going to break it all down because it would reconstruct the entire history that we have now, and that's something that they don't want to do. They don't want to even have to think about doing because it would be a disaster. And this is that's why I think this book is so impressive, because he's able to go through and relay it out. And does he get everything perfect? And is it all neat and tidy? Well, no, of course it's a disaster. It's a mess. But he's able to put it together a lot better than what we're given, because there's just too many dates that don't add up. They certainly don't. They don't work out. These sources just don't. They don't jive, I guess, for lack of a better way to say it. And hopefully we'll go through some of those going forward. I'm actually looking through my paperwork here because I do have a bunch of notes from when I'm reading that book, and I'll bring up some of the little notes I have.
Okay, sure. Okay, so the second topic. Do you want to go to the second topic, or?
Yeah, sure. I was thinking about some of the things that I have a problem with even before I read Fomenko's work was the whole idea of the Dark Ages. People need to think how much we've accomplished in 100 years. First plane flight was 100 years ago. First telephone call was 150 years ago. And really, when you look at all the things that we've discovered and humans have invented, to then picture a time period between 400 AD and 16, 17, 1800 AD where like nothing happened. Just people didn't do anything. They didn't invent anything. That doesn't seem too realistic
logical
to me. No, it just doesn't work. Humans always have a need to want to invent and to discover, and basically the story that they tell us certainly doesn't look like that. It certainly looks like, think about what they tell us. They tell us that Eratosthenes measured the shape of the round Earth or the ball Earth in 325 or whatever, it might be 275 BC, and knew that the Earth was a ball. So now picture that you are, a Spanish king, or you are somebody in Europe or the UK, in Britain, and you're telling me that from 275 BC all the way until 1492. Nobody thought to get in a boat and go west. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's just not. If they knew that the Earth was a ball, then they knew that you come back around the other side. So their whole thing doesn't make any sense. It actually makes more sense when you tell the story of Columbus being somebody who thought that the Earth was much smaller, or that the Earth was flat. Whatever because they tell us, oh no, nobody thought that. Nobody thought the Earth was flat. Well, doesn't that make more sense as to a reason why nobody went researching? Nobody went searching. But then again, there's a ton wrong with even that timeline, certainly. And I found so many writings about Columbus when I went looking at that stuff, that so much stuff has been added to his writings, always including stuff about the globe. They throw the globe in there. And I don't know if anybody, have you ever seen the Columbus map? Let me bring this up. There's actually a map that was found dated 1490. The map it's huge too. It's like 4 feet long. And it's in, I believe, in Paris right now. It's hard to find a good image of it, but when you find it, you can't tell me that this map is not a flat Earth map. And they certainly don't describe it that way. In fact, they contest even, let me see if I can find it here. Oh, here it is right here. I don't know if I can find a good size. See, it says here, untitled document, and there's evidence for it being clearly Columbus. See, Professor Wallace argues that there are two primary issues to consider when discussing Columbus's conception of the world. First, one must look at Columbus's conception of the circumference of the globe. And this is the mess that we find, is that you see, this is all, to me, fabrication, based on what the story that they want to be told now. And they blame it on, who's the guy that they blame it on that wrote about Columbus? They say that the whole flat Earth myth was attributed to him. I can't think of his name right now. But it certainly, if you go back and look at some of his writings and the conversations that he had and what he was writing about, it certainly looks like he thought that the Earth was flat. Okay, so I know you can't probably see this. It's hard to find. We're actually looking at an image here. I'm going to see if we can find a bigger size. It's hard to find a good size image of this map. And the reason why is clear. Oh, here's one. I lied. There's one from 1999, 12. Yeah, so this right here is a flat Earth map. And this is all the planets and the suns going around him. And this is, you can kind of see, this is Africa, and Europe up here, Spain. So this is supposedly his map from 1490, and it's huge. It's a beautiful map. It's here you can see right here. But if you start reading into it, and again, this is going to say the above map is a Columbus map drawn up by Bartholomew and Christopher Columbus in 1490 at his Lisbon workshop. Here's another map by Toscanini, drawn around 1474 AD. And so this map here is certainly crazy because it's a flat Earth map. So as much as they say everybody knew it was a globe, this map is laid out as a circular flat Earth map. Of course, they only show this is Africa, this is Asia, and Russia. So there's no place to go out here. They didn't know that there was anywhere else to go. And of course, I think the truth is too that he was certainly trying to go that way and see what he could find and see if he could come back the other side. So I'm not saying he didn't believe that there was a globe, or they weren't questioning the flat Earth, but they certainly did not. Everybody knew it was a globe, and Aristophanes measured it in 325 AD or BC. That's my whole point, is that the stories that they tell don't jive with reality. It just wouldn't work that, okay, he measured the globe, we know the size of it. Well then, Columbus wouldn't have sailed 3,000 miles and thought that he hit, he sent a letter back home saying that he hit an island off the coast of Japan or China, one or the other, and it was Havana. It was nowhere close. So, obviously the whole story that we're told is incorrect.
Right, I agree.
Somebody, I was just reading the super chat, somebody asking about the flat Earth. I'll get to that at the end. So you can continue. Sorry, I was just thinking of some other things before I look up my notes about history that just don't jive. And there's so much, about the pyramids that don't work. I've talked about that before. The North Star. Certainly interesting that they say that the Thuban was the North Star when the pyramids were built. However, today the pyramids point right to Polaris. So what you have to believe then is that we just happen to live in a period of time where that pyramid happens to be pointing at Polaris. And if we lived in the course of the last 4,000 years, the pyramid would point, the tunnels would point at nothing as the stars moved. As Thuban went away from the North Star and Polaris moved into place. But again, just looking at the name of that doesn't make any sense. And also, if you just look at the name of the Arctic in Antarctica, Arctic is a derivative of bear, which is because of the Big Bear constellation that includes Polaris. But anyway, go ahead.
Right. Well, they use climate change for that one. They say, well, the Earth's moving, so climate change is causing the problems that, and it turned Egypt into a desert. Yeah, that's what they use for that.
Right. And I've shown that 1970. There's news reports that I've shown on a couple videos where they say that we're in the middle of a cold, an ice age is coming, and so they just completely change it on everyone. And this is a kind of idea of history being different than we're told.
Right. Yeah, it's a mess, but we can kind of clean things up a little bit and try to make it appear a little bit more believable and logical. But one of the problems with history, of course, is the church history, and when you get into that, then you really have to think about what they've been teaching.
Yeah, that gets interesting, because it's a scary thought, and I understand why people don't want to venture there. And for me, I don't mind venturing there. I don't mind bringing it up, because again, what we have is we have written document that's written by man, and even if it was written by a divine being or it was inspired, I would have a feeling that divine being or inspired, the one that inspired it, would know what could happen to written text. And so when you really go back and you try and find these original documents, or you try and find the original Bible writings, that you can't find them. They, there's evidence of revelation being taken out and put in to the Bible numerous times. And, I think Fomenko believes that it's possible that the Old Testament was written after the New Testament. Isn't that what he says? I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah, he believes that the New Testament was written first because the New Testament talks about events that took place in the 13th century. And then thereafter, the Old Testament was written. From a logical perspective, it doesn't make sense why they would have the New Testament after the Old Testament.
Yeah, and a lot of people might have a problem with that.
First.
Right, and a lot of people might have a problem with that. And again, what it comes down to is you can go do your own research as far as how far do these things go back. What are they really talking about? I mean, there's been a lot of stuff. I've seen a lot of things on YouTube coming out recently that are pointing to Old Testament scripture that is mirroring moments in the sky. That the entire Bible may be actually a astrological book that is talking about prophecies, but basically spelling out things in the sky, which would, put it more recent, because that's when they started to learn these things. So we can't say when that stuff was written. And, just thinking about other things that I believe are lies, think about art. Okay, so if you look at art, and we've all learned this, that there was like a period of time where art they say that people couldn't draw in perspective, right? I don't know if people have seen that, but if you look back at art, and I'll bring some perspective art up. When you look at art, you see the old Christian drawings that look ridiculous, that look like people didn't know how to draw if somebody was close or far away, and they attribute that to like people didn't know until a certain date. And I don't believe that. I think it's all fabricated, because if you look at reality, you can draw. And so to pretend like these people were so ridiculously dumb that they didn't know how to draw in perspective is ridiculous, because the person could just look outside their door or look at reality in front of them and see things further away needed to be drawn smaller. But they tell us this whole fabricated thing about basically all this art that had no perspective was before 1400, or I don't know what the date is. It might be 1000 or something. Whenever they said people started to be able to draw in perspective. So that's another thing that I just don't agree with, that they try and use that to date things, but I think it'd be very easy to do that and fabricate it so that things look older than they are and things look newer than or compared to the old things, but they're all around the same time and just fabricated.
Right, the stick figures that you see on the cave walls, and
Right.
you know, they say that, well, back then they were cavemen, so they couldn't draw. The only thing they could draw was a stick figure. That doesn't make any sense,
Right.
because then all of a sudden in the 1300s and the 1400s and the Renaissance era, people could draw.
Right. Yeah, this
And
is.
paint.
I'm looking at a picture here that was drawn. Probably they're going to say it's 1600, 1500 or something here. I'm going to bring it up. But they say Perugino, Christ giving the keys to the kingdom of St. Peter. But when you look at this drawing, this is the idea of them saying now people were starting to realize how to draw in perspective. And you can see the lines going away and this and that. Now, if you go older than that, then they'll show you something ridiculous. So let me look up like Christian paintings. Let me look up oldest Christian paintings. And what you're going to see is they're going to try and tell us that these original people drew just terribly. And it's like they were children or something. And it's just not realistic. If somebody knew how to look at reality, they would be able to draw reality. They wouldn't draw like a kindergartner does. A kindergartner doesn't really know how to look at reality and draw it. They're going to draw things from their mind. But they want us to believe, and I'm having trouble finding any right now. But I'll find some here in a second when you're talking. But they just, the way that they draw somebody far away or somebody who's near you, they don't change the size of the person. And they try and force this on us as saying these are drawings from 300, 400, 500, 600. To me, they're all drawn at the same time. They're just drawn on purpose to make it look like dumb people drew them and then smart people drew them after and knew how to do perspective. But I don't think it's the truth.
Right. I mean, when you look at the drawings or the paintings from Pompeii, do those look like? Have you seen those? Have you seen those paintings? You know what I'm talking about? The paintings from Pompeii.
Oh yeah,
they found.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, those were supposedly painted in like 79 BC or even before that, 69 BC, somewhere around that time frame, supposedly. Flamenco thinks that was a medieval town because there are some drawings of medieval knights mixed in, but they don't show you that.
Right, they hide those ones.
Right. So, but the point is that they knew how to paint. That was the 1300s era, you know. They knew how to paint. They knew how to paint as good, but then they're trying to say that but during the 1300s to 1200s that they couldn't. There's no way they could paint anything like that.
Right, like if you think of the Egyptians that were so smart they could build these pyramids, but they could only draw two-dimensional stick figures or really terrible drawings. It just doesn't fit.
Hieroglyphics.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I'm actually reading here a Wikipedia article on perspective drawing and trying to see. But right from here, just talking about early history, that the earliest art paintings and drawings typically sized many objects and characters hierarchically according to their spiritual or thematic importance, not their distance from the viewer. They did not use foreshadowing. The most important figures. So this is just ridiculous. I mean, what they're telling you is that people were so dumb that nobody knew how to draw in perspective, which is not like something fancy other than it's just reality. So, you've seen people stand out with a canvas and they paint, a hillside or something. Well, when you paint that, you're painting what you see. So any hill that's far away from you, you will paint small, and any hill that's close to you, you'll paint big. What they want you to believe is that people were so dumb in the early AD period, and definitely going back into BC, that they did not know how to draw that way, that they could not look at reality and draw, that they just drew a bunch of, and we'll find some, I'm going to find some drawings and stuff, because they make it seem like the Renaissance was this coming of mind, and everyone learned how to draw and learned how to do science and learned to upset the old ways and got rid of the Bible, and it's just the way that they spell it out certainly seems like fabrication to me.
Right. Yeah, it certainly does. And church history goes along with that as well, because during the Renaissance, that's about the time, or from my opinion, that's about the time that the church history began, as far as the actual church that we know of today. And I think that if you think about that for a minute, regarding church history, the first Bible was you couldn't even purchase the Bible. You couldn't even own the Bible.
Yeah, you weren't allowed
until
to.
about 16th century.
See, and that's something people don't know, that they think that books were handed around, but no, only scribes could even read or write. So there was no way you were going to have a Bible. Even if you did have one, you wouldn't know how to read it. So until the printing press came out, there just wasn't a way to own the Bible. You had to know it either through oral history, which you've read the Bible before. If you've looked at it, it'd be impossible for somebody to know it orally, the entire thing. So
right, but think about the people who were illiterate, that they couldn't read.
Right.
And it was written in Latin. And if they spoke English, they couldn't, unless they knew Latin, they couldn't read it. And if they went to Mass every day, which that's what we're supposed to believe, that the lords and the ladies went to Mass every day, around 7 a.m. in the morning, every day they went to Mass.
Mm-hmm.
But if they didn't know Latin, they couldn't attend Mass. And we're told that these lords and ladies were pretty much illiterate.
Right, and yeah, up until
it doesn't make
up until the 1900s, they didn't say Mass in English; that it was said in Latin, with the priest with his back to the people in the pews. So, I mean,
right,
that's even recent, yeah.
Yeah, until 1961 when they changed it.
Yeah, I think it was mid 1900s. Mm-hmm.
And so, when you have to question that, because that doesn't make any sense. If the lords and ladies were illiterate, then how were they able to understand Mass? If they couldn't, if the clergy were the only ones who were reading Latin and or being taught Latin, then how were these other people, and especially the peasants and all these other people? Well, the peasants weren't really. I don't think they went to Mass according to. If you read medieval history, basically peasants were just plowing the fields all day, got up at 3 a.m. and plowed the fields all day, and then after the end of the day, they went home and ate pottage and took care of their family. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
And they lived on the land of their lord. It was called a feudal system. So the only ones who went to Mass were the lords and the ladies, and the, I guess, kings and the queens and anyone who was from the noble families back then. But the majority of those people couldn't read. They were illiterate.
Mm-hmm.
And unless they knew Latin, they probably didn't know what the priest was saying, unless there was an interpreter.
Right, which there wasn't.
So that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't fit. What we're being told doesn't fit. And so you got to be, and like I said, the first Bible was not allowed to be purchased until the 17th century. But you got to think about that. 325 was what was the Council of Nicaea. So from that point forward to the 15th, 16th century, that's over. It's about 1,200 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking at quite a huge number of years and centuries have passed before you could actually own or even purchase a Bible. You'd think by then, but sometime after maybe 400, 500 BC, they would have had their problems in the church, and then it would have cleared up, and then they would have been able to distribute the Bibles to everyone.
So I'm actually
unless,
go ahead.
Yeah, unless the Bible wasn't even written until like the 15th or 16th century or sometime around that time frame. Yeah. It doesn't make any sense.
No,
and that's what we're being told.
That's what I want people to be so careful of too. And again, I fully believe people can believe whatever they want and worship whoever they want, but just be careful with calling something that's a book written on paper truth, especially if you're basing that off of. I've heard a lot of people say to me, "Well, the cave, what are they called? The scriptures that they found, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Sorry,
Dead Sea Scrolls. Yeah,
right. That those were found and they match the Bible, but again, people don't understand how we date things, that there is no way to date the Dead Sea Scrolls, that the way they date them is based off the writing style, the paper, and where they were found, and that's it. So again, if I took a piece of papyrus and I was smart enough to know what words they used and how they wrote and with what ink, and I wrote on papyrus the Bible, and then I crumpled it up and put it in a jar and buried it in a place in Egypt, and somebody found it, 10 years from now, it would be dated to when I wanted to fabricate that date to. It's not, again, it's not proof of anything. And, I find this all the time in looking into and researching things, that we just need to be really careful of what we say is something is proof. That, you need to open your mind to the fact of, if somebody wanted to fabricate this, could they? And it's a lot easier than you think. We've heard people talking on Globebusters and stuff about cave paintings, and that cave paintings prove something. And again, there is no dating of the cave painting. It just is, they might find something around there. Same thing when you're talking about Stonehenge and these things. There is no dating of the rocks of Stonehenge. In order to get the date for that, you need to get some sort of carbon material. And for me, I don't even trust their dating systems. So really, we just need to be careful about what we're considering, the truth. I mean, we should be able to, if the Bible is as old as they say, then where are these original, documents that can accurately be depended on? And they don't exist. But I was just going to say, I was looking up, and on this Reddit, there's a lot of people asking these questions about why is it that, why did it take so long for artists to get to grips with perspective? Why aren't ancient medieval paintings three-dimensional or photorealistic? Why is ancient Middle Ages art is technically much worse than Renaissance art today? And this is what, people have these questions because they're good questions. And I think too many people just pass it off as, well, people back then drew shitty. And we just need to really think about that what you're saying is that for some reason people who were born 1,000 years ago didn't know how to look at reality and draw it, but you can. It just makes no sense. It's just not the case. I mean, it looks to be that we have a much shorter timeline than people think, and they made some shitty drawings and said, all right, we'll say these drawings are old. And so now you've got nice drawings by people within the last 500-600 years, and some drawings a bunch of Freemasons did and threw them back in time by simply saying, well, look how shitty this is. This is from 800 AD or whatever. And again, where's the dates that people would have put on the paintings that they drew? These things just all seem like a big fabrication.
Right. And another thing that's interesting about these paintings from the 15th, 16th century that I was going to get into regarding the problems with the church history is that these paintings show events that are supposedly ancient. Mm-hmm. And we're talking about bacchanals. We're talking about Dionysian feasts. We're talking about these paintings that show this Bacchic kind of tradition that they had back in Western Europe, all over Western Europe. And we're told that this tradition existed before the Dark Ages, in the BC period sometime. They push it way back because they don't want people knowing about it.
Right.
But yet these paintings are dated to 1615, the 15th century. And these paintings, of course, they show naked men and naked women. And we're told that, this was the lifestyle way back in the BC period. It wasn't during the Middle Ages. No. It pushed that thing way back there, But no, I disagree. I don't believe it. I think that this was the Middle Ages, and I think the Inquisition may have had something to do with stopping that type of tradition.
Well, and they got rid of any book that wasn't a book that they wanted. So if there was old books, they would have been destroyed. And what better story to tell than the fire at the Library of Alexandria, where all the books and all of our history got burnt. And that's why we're missing all this old text. And then they're able to pull it back together from this person retold the story from this person. And just reading this, just to kind of finish off that conversation there. But this is the kind of mainstream answer you'll get. And this person is a thinking person who says, why couldn't anyone think to paint the way the world looks? And this guy's answer is what the mainstream says by saying mathematically rigorous perspective was only developed in the 15th century. So what he's basically saying is it took mathematics for people to look at the world and draw it like it is, which is ridiculous. While some ancient artists had worked out that making things smaller in the distance and in the foreground made them look more real, they were really pretty haphazard about it. Early medieval artists had a different viewpoint on the matter. It's just, this is like the mainstream belief as far as, it took the Renaissance, it took science, it took mathematics to realize how to draw. And really, we just need to look at it because this is a good story to tell if you want people to think things are older than they are, and you want people to think things are because of science and education and because of the greatness of
Darwinism.
Right. Darwin, I was going to say, the whole idea of Jesuits and all these observatories. That's when they want you to think that that humanity came into this knowledge. And, I've done this before, but if you go to a population calculator, and this might creep some people out because it's certainly why I have a different opinion about our timeline. But this thing here, it's called Metamorphosis Alpha. And I'll just do a quick one here. Basically, it's a population calculator based on the growth rate. So I've had people say to me, you're using that calculator and it doesn't take into account people dying. It's like, yes, it does. That's what a growth rate is. Growth rate is simply your amount of people before the year starts and how many people you have at the end of the year. So if you have 1,000 people in your city and at the end of the year you have 1,010, then you have a 1% growth rate. And it's taking into account everybody that died, everybody that was born, everybody that fell off a mountain, whatever. They're all included in the growth rate. So right now it's set at 1.2%, which is, if you were to look up, what is our growth rate currently. And I think it's gotten as high as 2% in the population growth rate. It's gotten as high as 2% in like the 60s. But if we look at population growth rate in the world is currently growing at a rate of around 1.11% each year. So if you go back and just put that in, so that's instead of 1.1, it's 1.2, instead of 1.2, it's 1.1. Then you can put in your starting year, so we'll put in 0, and a starting population of 2. And people, what do you think you would have to do for an ending year? They tell us that humanity has been around for, I think, let's say they say 50,000 years. I think they might say 100,000. But let's go 50,000 years and let's calculate what our population would be at that point. Now, the fact that it's paused right here is because the number that it's about to come out is ridiculous and is not anywhere near reality. I probably should have started smaller because now this thing can't even think. But we'll give it a chance to come out. It will be in the sextillion. It may be a number we can't even fathom. Because really, when you look at our population and the fact that it's growing at that percent, we could easily be at 6 billion people in less than 2,000 years. And so when you think about that, and even with the so-called plague and everything else, in the past, it was better to have more children. In the 1700s, 1800s, people had 10, 15 children because you would have a farm. It would be helpful to your family the more helping hands you had. Now, a lot of people would die early, but still the growth percent wouldn't be a lot smaller than 1%. It wouldn't be smaller than it is now. Many people don't have children or just have one or two, and it would have been higher, I think, in the past. This can't even come up with this number. Let me get out of here just so I don't go too far. All right, let's try let's go to 10,000 instead. So calculating at 10,000. All right, so see this number up here? 64,951,009,529,649, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Something ridiculous. So, I mean, this tells you right here that, let's look at just 5,000 years, which is what the biblical perspective is, at a 1.1 growth rate percent. And the population in 5,000 years would be, what's that, million, billion, trillion, quadrillion, quintillion, sextillion, so 113 sextillion in 5,000 years. Let's back that down to 2,500 years. And we'll start getting closer. Now we're at million, billion, trillion, 1.5 trillion. That's just 2,500 years with a very low growth rate percent that we're at now. So really, when I started playing with this and understanding how population grows exponentially, it opened my eyes to, what could be the truth. I mean, if you put in a 2% growth rate, which we had in the 60s, and just 2,000 years, even that right there would be million, billion, trillion, 31 quadrillion. So it's just ridiculous. I mean, that means, put in, let's say 11 years, calculate that. So right there, that's 7 billion. So, I mean, this right here is our population right now, about 7.1 billion. And that's in 111 years with a 2% growth rate. So, that's pretty crazy to think about. Now, granted, they say that there was the Black Plague that happened in Europe that killed some high percentage of people. But I've also heard people contest that there's not any records of these people being disposed of. Where did all their bodies go? Go ahead.
The interesting thing about that is that Fomenko says that what may have caused that, or the reason that the church decided that nudity was a sin, and the reason that they decided that the sexual activity was a sin, because apparently before that, in the 1300s, it wasn't. It was like a Western tradition, from Western Europe, and so what they decided, apparently what may have happened, is that this plague may have been the result of some kind of may have been a sexual related disease of some kind.
Oh, interesting.
That may have caused the plague and wiped out a lot of people. And so the church fathers may have got together and said, okay, what we're going to do is reform a religion where this will never happen again. And I think that may have been, and I agree with that's what Fomenko thinks also, and I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's going to become a problem soon. I mean, people don't think it's not going to be in our lifetime as far as the population being a problem, but it will be soon. If you just put in the starting year of 2017 and the growth rate of 1.2%. And then an end year of, let's put in 2,400 just for an example, and a starting population of, we'll say it's 7 billion, and we'll calculate where we'd be at 2,400, and you're getting up into the, that's 674 billion. That's a huge amount of people that you're going to have a hard time feeding. That are, so a lot of people think, the idea of overpopulation is a myth, and I agree with that. There's plenty of room on the earth for everyone, but they better figure out in a hurry, take care of the people we have now, stop worrying about flying to Mars, and, before stuff gets like this. This is kind of ridiculous. But anyway, this is a cool site. It's called, I don't know if you guys can see you can't see my web bar. It's Metamorphosis Alpha, and if you just type in population calculator, it's always the number one Google result. So check it out. It's kind of fun to play with, and you can also tell it to show subtotals, which is crazy. I'll put in a less year here, but if you put in show subtotals, you can actually see, put in 1,200 and a 1% growth rate, starting population 2, and you can put in show subtotals, and then calculate, and it will actually show you the number all the way down, so you can scroll through every year, and basically all you're doing is seeing that it grows by 1.2%. So again, if you have 2 people, well then after year 2 you have 2 people, because 1% isn't going to grow your population all the way till you're at year 41, and then that 1% kicks in an extra person, and then you stay there till your 1% kicks in another. So anyway, it's a kind of cool site, but go ahead and continue on with let's start getting into the church stuff.
Sure. Okay. Well, back to the church stuff. The oldest Hebraic manuscript in existence is from the 9th century. Okay, so this is according to Scaligerian chronology, 859 AD. The second oldest manuscript is dated to 916 AD, and the other is dated to 1008 AD. And it's supposed that the biblical canon was agreed at the Laodicean Council of 363, but no edicts of this council remain in existence. And the same concerns the Council of Nicaea. Mm-hmm. Okay, but the canon was really made official by the New Trident Council called in 1545, the Epic of the Reformation, and continued until 1563. So that tells you that something's wrong with the history when no edicts of that council from the Laodicean Council of 363 exist, and there's no edicts of the Council of Nicaea as well.
Right.
So what happened to the edicts? What happened to the originals?
Yeah, that reminds me of the whole issue with Kepler and all those guys that people haven't done any. I haven't seen any flat Earth videos on it yet, and I was going to do one, and I need to do more research on it. But the whole idea of everything that Kepler came up with, that he said was based off of Diophantus's opus and that kind of stuff, but that didn't come out, meaning it wasn't found until after his death. So what he's doing is he's actually referring there that he's basing his mathematics, and then Copernicus based him off Kepler's, but they're basing it off of a book that wasn't found. It's basically not possible. They couldn't have been referring to documents that didn't exist yet, and that kind of goes through the whole idea of canonical sections that was by Apollonius, which was published until somewhere in the 1500s, and
right.
Kepler, who was the first one to discover, or I think he stole it from Tycho Brahe, but was to discover the significance of conical sections, which is ellipses, in astronomy. He didn't live even to see the publication of the works that he based his books off of. So I mean, it doesn't even make any sense. They were published in a Latin translation in 1631. Again, he was long gone. So the body of work of this ancient Apollonius only got published in its entirety after the discovery of the objects that this ancient writing deals with in Kepler's epoch. So it's just impossible. And the works of him, which were an edited version of the Pole Copernicus, the name Apollonius is identical to Polonius. It's a Pole, a native of Poland, or Polonia or whatever. So the astronomer Copernicus was the immediate precursor of the astronomer Kepler. So it's just it's all a mess, and it gets to be to the point where you just realize, okay, wait a second, everything is a concoction. It's a mistake in somebody trying. I mean, imagine how hard that would be if right now a bunch of people decided to redo history. They're going to make so many mistakes because it's not as easy as it looks, especially if you're going to try and date things to try and tell a story like, oh, we were dumb and then we can't found this and then we found math and then now we have all these, we know how the planets work. They're trying to write a history for us that we should be able to recognize is a fabrication. And I don't think people look into it enough, and I understand why, because it's something a lot of people have asked me, when are you going to do a video on history? When are you going to do a video on the mistakes of history? And I keep saying the same thing, which is it can't be proven any more than the current history. But I think that it's important because people need to look at it and realize that our history is a lie. That's the important part. Now, trying to construct something new, again, you can read Fomenko's work, and I have, and in some, I've only gone through a book and a half, but in it, there's some things I agree with, some things I don't agree with, but it's certainly more, it certainly seems like somebody's trying to actually make sense of documents and history and research, whereas when you actually go and look at our real history that we've been told, nobody's trying to make sense of that. It doesn't even make sense, and it's a mess, and nobody's trying to correct it. You'll see all the time, all these historians who will say, he did talk about this, and that doesn't make a lot of sense, and this person may or may not have existed. This person may have been a fabrication. I mean, there's so many people who think Homer's real, who think all these guys that we were taught were actually writers ever existed, and the more that you look into the research on that, I don't think that they did.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And when we were talking about the church, that Trident Council, some books were destroyed, and one of those books was the Chronicles of the Judaic and Israeli Kings. Mm-hmm. And Fomenko says that they were destroyed because they described history differently from what the church fathers approved of.
Right.
So basically, it may have been describing the history of the 1300s and the Baltic cults and the traditions that they had in the 1300s, the real Middle Ages that we don't ever hear about.
Yeah.
And that's what these books may have been describing.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the interesting things about the Old Testament is that it was written in Hebrew, but they didn't have signs for vowels originally, or any other signs to replace them. So the books of the Old Testament were nothing but consonants.
And no punctuation.
Right, no punctuation.
Mm-hmm. So
BLD could have stood for build or bald or anything.
Right.
That has BLD in it. And then the common opinion used to be that vowels were introduced in the Hebraic text by Ezra in the 5th century BC. But when Levita and Capellus proved this wrong, or Levitia and Capellus proved this wrong in the 16th and the 17th century, they demonstrated that the vowels had only been introduced by the Masoretes. The discovery made a huge sensation in Protestant Europe because the vowels weren't in existence until around the probably the 16th or 17th century in the Bible. And that's about the time that you could purchase a Bible. That's about the time that the church allowed you to read a Bible. Before that, you couldn't. The church wouldn't allow it.
I'm getting pissed here. I'm reading this. These cave paintings that I was looking at are paintings of people's hands. There's just a bunch of hands on a wall. And it says these cave paintings or wall drawings or whatever are prehistoric, dating 40,000 years ago. So again, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about, that they want you to believe that people 40,000 years ago could only paint their hand. And basically put that on walls, and that's how dumb humans were 40,000 years ago. They were like animals who were just learning to draw, and so they painted their hands on the walls 35,000 years ago. And it even says that there's not even a sign of habitation in those caves. So these people, just a herd of nomadic humans, showed up and painted their hands on a cave and then took off. You can believe whatever you want. It's just, for me, when I see things like this, especially with my view of the world now, this is all meant to tell a story of evolution, of humans who were cave dwellers, who were dumb and hunter-gatherers, and they painted their hands on walls. Right. It's just nonsense.
Yeah, it's an agenda.
It's an agenda.
It's an agenda.
Yep. And again, these can't be dated. When they tell you they're dating that, they're not. They can't date wall paintings. It's not dateable. So if you looked up how they dated it, they're going to say they found some burned ashes near the wall of a fire, and when they dated the carbon that was in there, it came back as 40,000 years old. That's what they're going to tell you. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so the Scaligerian history is of the opinion that Jerusalem can be located at the settlement the locals called El Quds, which is this is modern Jerusalem. Okay, so Anatoly Fomenko believes that the modern Jerusalem is the wrong Jerusalem. It's not even the real Jerusalem of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And that is because, now this goes into the history of the Crusades. So in the Crusades, the knights, if you don't know the history of the Crusade, Pope Urban gave his speech, supposedly, and it made the knights want to go to Jerusalem and fight. This was several thousand miles away if they were in England. So what they did is they traveled along the road to Jerusalem, but before they got to modern-day Jerusalem, they decided to attack Constantinople. But it doesn't make any sense because they were going to attack Jerusalem. But do you see what happened? Constantinople was once called Jerusalem.
Right.
And there's evidence of that because there are paintings and forget what the name of that. There's a painting where it shows a ship, and they are traveling to the Holy Land, and it shows the outside of the Holy Land, and it's a wall, and it has a golden chain attached to it. That's Constantinople, because that golden chain was famous for that's how they knew that that was Constantinople. Another thing about Constantinople is it had several water mills, and you could see those from a distance. And those water mills are also on that painting. And it says, it shows that these men were taking a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And then it shows Constantinople behind it. So either that was the real Jerusalem, or it was one time called the Holy Land for whatever reason. It doesn't make any sense why they would call it the Holy Land unless it really was the Holy Land, where Jesus may have preached and lived and died. So that makes more sense that Constantinople was the real location for that instead of modern-day Jerusalem. Which another thing is that modern-day Jerusalem, the original Jerusalem was said to be the navel of the world and surrounded by water. Does that sound like modern-day Jerusalem?
Right, no.
And, there's other problems with that as well, because the Knights found some relics when they went to Constantinople. And the palace of, I'm not even going to pronounce that, Bucolian, I believe that's right, Robert of Clary, who was a knight, found a tunic of Jesus. He found a vial full of fresh blood that belonged to Jesus. And he also found parts of the cross that was the cross that Jesus was hung on. So how could he have found, and this was in, I believe it was 1204 AD.
Yeah, and just so people know,
how could they?
Fomenko believes Jesus was crucified in around 1100.
1185.
1185, right.
What and he says that, and here's the interesting thing about that also. The man that he says was supposedly Jesus, the real Jesus, was crucified on September 11th, 1185.
Oh, really?
Yes. And then here's another thing. It gets even weirder. Instead of being tied to a cross, Fomenko says that he was tied between two pillars.
Interesting.
Yeah. Two twin pillars is what he called them.
I haven't read that yet. That's Freemason.
Yeah.
Big Freemason sign. Man, you know what? It's creepy. I'll go ahead and say this. It's kind of a personal story, but when my grandfather died, I wasn't there, but my mom was at his side when he died, and she tells the story that he was a deeply devout Catholic man. I mean, one of the greatest people I've ever known. He died when I was like around 15 or 16, and just one of those good-hearted people that cared about everybody. The only time I ever saw him yell was if my grandmother was making him late for church, and he was just a good guy. But when he died, he told my mom as he was dying, his final words were over and over again, the two white pillars, these two white pillars. And my mom kept asking, what about him? What about him? And he just kept saying, there's two white pillars. So it's kind of funny is when I found about Freemasonry, and I know my grandpa had nothing to do with that, but I've always kind of thought, was he trying to tell me to go after these Masons? But it's interesting that you say that possibly that's where the Jesus that is the real Jesus, not the one that they've told us, but the actual Jesus, maybe that's how he was killed. Interesting.
Right. It is very interesting. His name was Andronicus Komnenos the First. You can look that up and find out, he did die. I believe they hung him up September the 10th, but he died the next day, September 11th. That's very interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. I've even heard stories that, a lot of people don't know Jesus' real birth date, but I've heard a lot of people saying it's April 1st, which is funny because, why is that April Fool's Day?
That's interesting, yeah.
Interesting.
Another thing that's interesting is when they hung him up on that, between those two pillars, a Latin soldier, or Roman soldier, came up and stabbed him with a spear in the side, just like Jesus.
Yep.
Just like the story of Jesus. And you can read that and you can see that. I think it's on Wikipedia. And you can look that up, and that really struck me as that's probably the real Jesus that they're talking about from history. If it's not, I don't know who else it could have been, because that. And another thing that happened that Famiko found that happened on that same day was there was a solar eclipse that happened on that same day.
On the day that he died?
Yes.
That's another thing that people should know, that flamenco uses a lot of the solar eclipses and things to date things going back in time, which a lot of our current understanding or chronology it fails at. Certain dates that should be on eclipses are not, and they just chalk it up to missing time, or that it's due to the Gregorian date change.
Right. And another interesting thing about celestial objects in the sky is Halley's Comet.
Oh yeah, you want to talk about that, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very interesting story. But we haven't even touched base on the English history yet, so if I tell you about the Halley's Comet thing, it's not going to make any sense, because I haven't told you about the English history yet, because that's part of it.
Well, like I said, I wasn't because we just decided on this, this week. But if people want us to explore the history thing some more, and please comment on the video, and we can get back together, and maybe we need to do a whole show on a certain time period, and actually I'll get my notes together so I can better. We just wanted to kind of do an overview of some things, but you can start with the English history if you want.
Okay, sure. Okay, so English history is made up of several, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Okay, well, that's just one of the manuscripts that it's made up of. And that includes Manuscript A, the Parker Chronicle, and that was made, or that's the history that lists the history of from 60 BC to 1070 AD. Then there's Manuscript B, the Abaddon Chronicle, which covers the epic of the alleged years of year 1 AD to 977 AD.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's Manuscript C, the Abaddon Chronicle 2, which covers the epic between the alleged years 60 BC and 1066 AD. And then there's Manuscript D, the Worcester Chronicle, which spans the epic of the alleged years 1 to 1079 AD. And then there's Manuscript E, and it's called the Laud Chronicle, spanning the years 1 AD to 1153 AD. Manuscript F, the bilingual Canterbury Epitome, which spans the alleged years 1 AD to 1058 AD. And so historians believe these chronicles to be duplicates of a single original, since they list the year 1 several times, and they go back and say 60 BC and then 1 again, 60. So they believe that these are duplicates of an original copy. But the only problem is that the earlier copy of the manuscript perished in a fire. So they don't have the original copy.
Right.
And the Manuscript A exists in only 2 copies, both of which were made in the 16th century. And this tells the history of England. And it was made in the 16th century. So, and there's been historians who have who spoke out about this. And one of them was named Dom David Knowles. And he made a statement that the issue of the origins and respective dependencies between the different versions is so complex that any sort of discussion on the topic implies the use of advanced mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's G.N. Gammonsway, who made the remark that manuscripts A and E are associated with names of 16th century figures, namely Archbishop Parker, who lived from 1504 AD to 1575 AD, Archbishop Laud, who lived from 1573 to 1645 AD, and it turns out that the other manuscripts of the Chronicle had once belonged to Sir Robert Cotton, who lived from 1571 to 1631 AD, and are now part of the Cotton's manuscript and kept in the British Museum. And Anatoly Fomenko says the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles were written, most likely all written, in the 15th and 16th century, the earliest.
Certainly.
Then there's the other manuscript called The History of the Brits by Nennius. The Chronicle is relatively brief. It contains 24 pages. But the earliest manuscripts date from 9th and 10th century AD, the latest ones from the 13th and the 14th century. But the author who wrote the manuscript is Gildas. Nennius is seldom mentioned as the author. So the original text the original text of this manuscript has not survived, but we have an Irish translation, supposedly from the 9th century. And this is this historian of history of the Brits, I think, is one of the ones that mentions King Arthur, or he was mentioned in the history as one of the. They mentioned him as a commander. They didn't mention him as a king. He was only mentioned as like a Roman commander or something like that. He wasn't a king apparently when they mentioned him. And then there's Historia Brittonium by Galfurdus, first printed in the year 1508. So all of these manuscripts of the history of England were all in the 16th century apparently. And then if you look at the Bayeux Tapestry, the Bayeux Tapestry is supposed to tell the story of William the Conqueror. And William the Conqueror, if you don't know the story about William the Conqueror, he was Duke of Normandy who basically was promised the throne of England by Edward the Confessor when he was a child. But as Edward the Confessor was laying in his deathbed, he promised the throne to Harold. And that angered William the Conqueror. He found out about it. He gathered an army together in France and came over from France to England and landed at Senlac Hill, and there was a battle at Hastings. And apparently Harold was killed at the Battle of Hastings. And they're not sure how he was killed. One source believes he may have been killed with an arrow. The other source believes he may have been cut down by knights, but no one really knows exactly how he died. But the interesting thing about that Bayeux Tapestry also is that there's a comet on that tapestry. And let me back up.
Mm-hmm.
But the Bayeux Tapestry is supposed to tell the history of England, and it's supposed to, or not the history of England, but the history of William the Conqueror. But the problem is, Fomenko dated that tapestry. There was a zodiac on that tapestry, dated to March 15th, 1495. So that says, this was supposed to have been 1066 when the Battle of Hastings occurred. 1066.
Right.
So if it didn't happen in 1066, and this Bayeux Tapestry was supposedly made not too long after the Battle of Hastings, along with the building of the Tower of London, which was built supposedly in 1078 AD. So if the Tower of London wasn't built in 1078 and the Bayeux Tapestry wasn't created in the time frame after, not too long after the Battle of Hastings, then what is the Bayeux Tapestry showing? Because apparently it's not showing the Battle of Hastings if it was created in 1495.
Right.
And that calls into question the succession of line of kings and queens from the William the Conqueror time frame, 1066, or actually, yeah, it was 1066. He was crowned king on Christmas Day of 1066. So that calls into question the succession of line of kings and queens from 1066 to the 15th, 16th century, early 16th century. I mean, were they made up, or where did they come from?
Mm-hmm.
If because that's supposed to be one of the main founding parts of the English history is the Bayeux Tapestry. That tells the story of William the Conqueror. But then, of course, there's a Doomsday Book. Basically, it was kind of a census that was taken. I think it was 1087, somewhere around there, 1086, 1087, right before William the Conqueror died. There was a census made of England.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is that this census talks about things that were popular, that property that was heard of, mostly talked about like in the 15th and the 16th century. So it's hard to say when the Doomsday Book was actually created, but it sounds like it may have been either the 15th century.
Right.
But then the Halley's Comet is the one thing on that tapestry that really it's really going to shake some people up, because that comet was seen all over Europe, and it was supposedly an omen of doom. And that's what Harold and his men said before William the Conqueror came over from France. They said that it was an omen of doom. Well, not only did they say that, but in 44 BC, after Julius Caesar died, the Romans said, after a comet came over, after they seen a comet, they said it was an omen of doom as well. So then we have a painting that was made in I believe it was dated 1456, and it shows a comet flying over a castle, and this castle is on fire. Okay, then we have a story about how at one time England was on fire from one side of the island to the other because of a meteorite that struck. And you can find that information. Alan Wilson has a website, and he gives a lot of good, interesting references. But he thinks it was a meteorite that struck. But what is that? The question is, if this was all one single event, what was it? And if it wasn't a meteorite, or it wasn't a comet, and comets don't exist because we're not in space, and there's no comet spinning around us on the Earth, then what was that? That's the question. I'm not saying there is a comet. I'm just saying that's one thing that needs to be looked into, because if that was one single event that affected Europe, then that's something that we need to, I guess, we could look into it and find out for sure what it was. But the interesting thing is, if that was 1456 when that painting was discovered or was made, then that calls into question if the Bayeux Tapestry, since it was made in 1495, that says, well, okay, so were they showing the comet that came and that the painters were painting in 1456? Was that the same celestial event, or was that something else?
Right.
But since it was only 42 years later, what if it was that event? And around that time was the fall of Rome as well. 1453, well, not Rome, but Flamenco calls it the actual Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. That Constantinople fell by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. So 1453 and 1456 are not that's 3 years. So what are we looking at? Was there an invasion of England in that time, or was there? If there was an invasion of England, then does that mean that what does that mean? That's the question.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very interesting. But I mean, if there's some kind of I don't know, something in the sky that happens every once in a while that's a natural phenomenon, maybe that's what it was. Every so often, maybe something happens. What do you think a comet is?
I have my own opinion of what I think they are. It's probably a crazy opinion, but I guess in a way I think that things can tend towards Earth, and so if there were outstretched mountains at the Earth's edge, or who knows how high they go, but it's certainly interesting to me that comets and those things are ice. They're ice and they're metal, and it just kind of I wouldn't doubt that there's something that could kind of fall back towards Earth and come back through the atmosphere. I mean, I don't know. It's that would all be conjecture, but I certainly am not somebody who says they're all fake.
Right.
I think that I don't think anybody's necessarily throwing them at the Earth. Or just yesterday, I think there was quite a few sightings in Southern California and Arizona. I know I've seen one. My wife's seen one. So I'm not sure what they are exactly. But I'm not somebody who says that they're fake. I don't think that they're on a periodic cycle. I don't think that Halley's Comet is a recurring thing. But again, it'd be easy for them to fabricate something like that to where it just goes to prove their cosmology. If you said something like that happens once, because nobody saw Halley's Comet last time it was here. I mean, very few people saw it.
Right.
Enough that it would, there's nothing even to bank on. But I certainly am not somebody who says they don't exist. If that's what you're asking.
And it may have been just a single event, and it may have been, who knows? It may have been a volcano. Well, I don't think it was a volcanic eruption.
But that's the kind of thing that we don't know. I mean, for instance, if there was some sort of volcano that is beyond our ability to get to, maybe it's throwing ice particles back towards the Earth. I mean, we wouldn't know that.
Right.
And it's tough when you're lied to about where you live. Well, then you're just guessing when you're confronted with things like meteors or asteroids or things like that. That if it wouldn't be hard to know if it wasn't for the fact that we had to figure out where the hell we live and what's around us and what those things are very important to knowing what a meteor is.
Oh yeah, I agree. And like I said, I wasn't saying that we're on a spinning Earth when I mentioned the comet. I was just.
Oh no. Okay. No, I don't think that that's true at all. I think that even going back, the whole idea of science and the whole Copernicus thing is clearly an attempt to get away from what was believed for all times, which was the centrality and the non-movement of the Earth, which is evident in every sense. There's never been a person that's ever felt the Earth spinning. It's completely right in front of us, and all of our senses tell us the same thing. Now, it happens to be that there's some men who say that they know differently. Unfortunately, their evidence for it is minuscule and to me not worth considering. I mean, I don't mind if it's taught as a idea or as a possibility, but to teach it as fact is where I have a problem.
Yeah, I agree. And it's being taught in schools.
Right.
And, teachers are teaching it as it's something that it is fact.
Well, they don't have a choice. That's the hardest part about it is, if science was what science claims to be, then there's no way you can possibly have a problem with it. If science is about, what is our current best guess, and we teach it that way, but we teach it as a guess, or we teach it as our best hypothesis and allow people to use their mind to consider other options. But when science laughs at you, for instance, they teach relativity. They teach that to everybody. It's a relativistic universe, that there's no absolute motion. So, once you understand that, then the idea of whether or not the Earth goes around the sun or the sun goes around the Earth is not a scientific question anymore, because neither one can be true, neither one can hold any more clout than the other. Yet in our science, they teach you its relativity. They teach you Einstein's this genius who brought relativity, and everything operates under relativistic rules, but we go around the sun. And if you say something different, they'll laugh at you. If you say that the sun goes around the Earth, they will laugh at you. Well, that's completely a incorrect statement of science. Science cannot judge whether the Earth goes around the sun or the sun goes around the Earth, because it's relative. Relativity tells us that from the Earth, the sun goes around us, and from the sun, the Earth goes around it. So neither one is more correct than the other. Yet science will tell you one is more correct, that one is ridiculous thought, and the other one is the truth. And again, that's just not, then we don't live in a relativistic environment. So their whole ideas, the way they teach them, are incorrect. They're not conducive to having children understand what science means or what science is capable of doing. The fact that we have right and wrong answers on a science test is a problem, because there is no right or wrong answers. There's only current ideas or current thoughts or current beliefs, and to just dismiss things like creation and laugh at that, but then teach children about the Big Bang, which is, you've just taught creation. You've just laughed at somebody's idea of creation and then said everything that there is, meaning every animal, every plant, every planet, every space dust, all came from nothing in an instant. And it's counterintuitive. It's not conducive to what we experience every day. It's completely out in left field. And if that's the truth, then that's fine. Like I said, if things are true, things are true. But they lie to us about all these things, and you don't need to lie about the truth. You don't need to tell lie. If the Earth's a globe, then the Earth's a globe, and that's the end of the story. You wouldn't even need to worry about it, because it proves itself. Yet throughout history, we're told these lies, which I can go back and find and see things about the Columbus story that don't make sense. We were all taught that Columbus proved the Earth was a globe. We were all taught different aspects of this science lore, and then they switch them on you. They tell us that the water goes down the opposite direction in different hemispheres, and so you believe that, and it goes to you trusting their idea of science and trusting the globe. So when you find out that that's not true, then I don't know what they expect us to think. It's like, you lied to me to get to the truth across. That doesn't seem like you would need to do that. I talked about it before, that video that they have of those college kids that sent up and by the way, just so everybody knows what we're watching Dwayne Kellum's recent launch, so I have that on playing in the background. But when they launched a balloon like that from a college, and then it showed up all over the news, on every news station, every website, that these college students show the curvature of Earth. And I was upset, because they said this is clearly a GoPro camera, and I went and found the person who made the video, and when you confront him with it, he said, we never said anything about, we know that's not the curvature of the Earth because we used a GoPro camera. And it just shows, somebody with the media told these outlets to run with this story of the curvature of the Earth. And it's just like, no, that's not the curvature of the Earth. Why are you lying to people? If the Earth is a globe, we don't need you to force it down our throats with, oh, these students prove the curvature of the Earth. You don't need to do that. The only time you would do that is if you're trying to lie to people. So you bring up things that are not true, when a lot of people, they're going to see that and just think, oh, the Earth's curved because these guys found the curvature. But it's not true. They weren't even trying that, and they used a GoPro camera with a fisheye lens. They knew it. So when I see things like that, it just becomes obvious. And I always bring up the George Ellis quote, which I think is telling, because George Ellis is probably top 5 physicists in the world, and for him to say that that cosmology has a lot of different models that can be proven with our observations, and they chose their direction philosophically. And he even admits that he doesn't have a problem with that personally, that he actually agrees with that mindset, that there's no way we're the center of the Earth or the center of the universe. So he agrees with mainstream science. However, he says the problem is that a lot of cosmology tries to hide the fact that there's other models that will work, and he has a problem with that. And that, I think, is an upstanding thing to say, because for a lot of us, we don't think, well, now we do, but before we didn't think science was about lying. That there was, because they teach us that there's no such thing as lies in science, right? There's no such thing because your foe or your peer will try and defeat you, will try and prove you wrong with his experiments, when really that's not the case at all. The fact that it's like a boys' club, and they got together and decided, no, there's no way we are the center of the universe. So any observation we make, we will force it into the basket that says we are just one of the many flying orbs in space. And that's what they did. So all these observations that they get, all of them is seeing somebody's here. Thank you. All the things that they put out in front of us are all just pushed into their bucket. Agenda, yeah. Right. And that's sad, because, and then they laugh at people who think the opposite, which is even worse. So if somebody says they believe in geocentrism, they'll get laughed at like it's been proven that that's not possible, when it is completely possible. In fact, it gets rid of dark energy, it gets rid of dark matter, it explains every observation. It certainly makes more sense than the heliocentric model, which again is just a piecework of nonsense, right? I mean, if you look at the history of that, Copernicus thought the sun was 3 million miles away, and they thought that the sun was the center and that everything orbited around it. Well, it wasn't until later that people said, wait, hold on a second. If what you're saying about gravity and everything is true, the sun can't sit in the center and not have something to hold it there. How is it just sitting there? So then they said, oh, well, it's going around the Milky Way. And then, well, how is the Milky Way? Oh, the Milky Way is going around the center. So they have to keep improving on their idea. So their whole idea of heliocentricity isn't even the right name for it, because heliocentric means sun-centered, but nothing is sun-centered because the sun goes around something else. So it's just like it's all crap, and they really could bring it all back by saying, hey, let's look at this again. Could we be the center of the universe, since we see every galaxy moving away from us, since we see everything that they observe can work in a position where humans are the center? And I don't see a problem with teaching that. If it doesn't match an observation, well, then I have a problem with it. But if it matches all observations, why would you push people into the belief that they're nothing? Like Carl Sagan says, we're just out here on this blue dot in the middle of some forgotten corner. When you teach people that, you should expect to have wicked people, because they don't care. They don't think they'll ever be held responsible for their actions.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
It just sucks, because
I don't believe that.
No.
I believe, and I know I'm talking about history and the fact that the Bible is probably written a lot later than what we thought, but I still believe in a creator. So I still believe, there's no way that anything could, us being here could have just spontaneously happened.
No, I don't. There's no way.
I don't believe that at all.
No, in fact, anybody that does, I would love to have a conversation with them about how they must believe in what they've been told and not how they feel and what the world is around them. Because, and whether or not, I think what happened too is, and this is, my own opinion, I have my own thoughts about whether or not science believed that the Earth was a ball originally, and, whether or not it was a deception from the beginning. Because I tend to think that what we have around us and what we see is a result of a church that tried to hold dominion over people, and science wanting to get away from that dominion, and they did a good job of that, but I think they latched onto something that ended up being wrong. And when they realized it, they also realized that they had no way out. They had to keep faking it, because the other option was to go back under the control of the church with even more clout for the church, because you had said that they were wrong, and then now you're saying that they were right, so now they can throw that back in your face. So science said, nope, we don't want anything to do with that. We would rather keep telling this lie and pushing forward with the other ideas of science. And they're ultimately trying to disprove it, right? I mean, they don't want there to be a creator. They don't want any of that stuff. A lot of those guys they think they're the greatest thing to ever come along. Neil deGrasse Tyson, the idea of somebody smarter than him, somebody that knows more than him, he doesn't want anything to do with that. So those guys love the idea of evolution and love the idea of they're the top of the pecking order. They're basically the highest rung because they're the most evolved that there is right now, and they learned about the universe and they know everything there is to know. And that's just ridiculous in my mind that they would ever think that everything that is came into fruition accidentally. So I would love to talk to anybody who thinks that, because it's just, I think you've fallen for the same trick. And I know this because I fell for it. Even growing up religious, for 6 months of my life, I was an atheist that thought that evolution was true and that this was all accidental. And when I look back now, it was clearly because I succumbed to the words of men, and that's the worst thing that you can do. I just believed them, believed that they dated the Earth, and I would laugh at somebody and say, the Earth is 4.54 billion years old. Come on. I mean, these guys have found that. They know that. And I find these guys saying the same thing to me all the time. But they don't know how. They don't know why. They don't understand the dating. They don't understand how things could change in a blink of an eye. And so it's sad that so many people have been led astray from, if we just would have kept the Earth at the center and told people that, hey, we don't know. Because I think what happened is a lot of scientific people hate the Bible, hate the God of the Bible, hate Christians, and for the way that they act or the way that they try and push their religion on people. And for me, I'm not even disagreeing with that thought. But I think that doesn't mean because humans have done a bad job representing God or representing the Creator, that they've done a bad job of explaining the Creator, that it means that the Creator doesn't exist. That's the most ridiculous. And that's what I think a lot of these people have chosen. They make fun of the Bible and they make fun of the God of the Bible. And then from that, they say God doesn't exist. Well, I think you got to be real careful there that, to me, I think, God or the Creator would be far more intelligent than every human mind combined. And so when you're talking about that kind of idea or thought or spirit or entity, well, no human's going to be able to describe that at all. And so to simply look at the Bible and say, hey, these people 3,000 years ago, or in our mind 1,000 years ago, whatever it was, they did a poor job of describing the Creator. He must not exist. Well, I just look at it and say these guys did a poor job of describing the Creator because it's a hard thing to describe. And, I can leave it at that and chalk it up to that. Whereas other people chalk it up to, well, it means that God doesn't exist because Christians think if somebody walked on water, so therefore no God exists. I don't think that's a good conclusion to come to. I think it's more likely the case that people have always struggled to explain that feeling that we all have inside. And some people have dismissed it. Some people have turned their back on it. Some people have decided that it must not be real because other people have done a poor job for them of explaining it or teaching it. There's a lot of hypocrites in Christianity. There's a lot of hypocrites in a lot of religions. And in every religion, because it's just people trying to explain the unexplainable. And so maybe we don't need to explain it so much as to recognize it and kind of like embrace it and know that there's a reason why we're here. And certainly it's better to act as a decent, helpful part of humanity than to become part of its detriment. And that's what sucks, right, is that I just see a world that's gotten worse since I was a child because people have fallen for this idea of science. And a lot of people, you hate science. What do you have? I don't have a problem with science, but I do see the outcome of the way that science has taught people. And it is clear when you see those cynical, laugh in your face, I'm better than you, look at, it's just these people who follow science. And I've said it a million times, it's a cheap out for dumb people, because you can be the dumbest rock on earth and you can make fun of people and you can pretend like you're always right as long as you follow science, because no matter what anybody else says, I get so many people who want to debate me. I want, come debate me, It's like, debate you when you get the side of proven fact and I've got to go against all of what you consider to be fact. I mean, how could I possibly win that? And I've described it like going up against a Christian who gets to use the Bible as the truth. And that nobody would debate a Christian if they get to use the Bible as truth because they win already. And that's kind of what it feels like when it comes to the globe is, well, yeah, if that's your truth, If you're going to throw, trigonometry at me and you're going to say, well, here's my paperwork on this, and here's these orbits, they all work perfectly. And, well, okay, I'm not saying that they don't work mathematically. I'm saying it's not reality. And that's a hard thing to argue in any kind of debate. But, it is what it is. This is crazy.
Right.
I'm getting dizzy watching this balloon trip. Oh, you can't see it. Just so everybody knows, Clint's actually on the phone, so he doesn't see what, so he's not getting dizzy and wanting to throw up. Just me. Is that the moon that keeps going by? I can't tell, but every once in a while it's popping up in the air, and I think I see the moon. I don't know, but now I'm dizzy. Woo! I'm gonna throw up here. So anyway, so yeah, what I'll ask everybody to do, because we've passed 2 hours here, but if people want us to cover a certain area, and if anybody else would like to join us, if you've looked into flamenco stuff and want to have a little panel where we talk about one specific subject. I know today we danced around a whole bunch of things, and that probably wasn't hugely helpful. But I think introducing his stuff, because like I said, and I think if you have Amazon Prime, if I'm not mistaken, I think the reason I was able to read 1 and 2 was because it's on their free list or something. But if you have it and you can get it, it is in PDF form, and it's an interesting read. It's better than anything else you read because it's all new information. It's everything that you've heard of in the past, re-evaluated with evidence and research. And, for me, we just get told history, but nobody tells us the research that goes into it, right? We were just told this person wrote this book at this time, here comes this person and this person, but there was no really, it's just like everything else we're taught, right? That there's really no supporting evidence for it. And when you go looking for it, it actually breaks down even worse. It becomes a complete and total mess when you see these guys writing and referring to other people's papers that didn't exist at the time, or, like I said about Aristophanes being talked about by, I think it was Herodotus or Hieron, I think his name is, who came like only 50 or 100 years after him, also worked with geography and also worked with geometry, and doesn't ever mention in any of his writings Aristophanes, who's supposedly this genius that measured the shape of the earth 100 years before him in the very city that he lived in. It just is something that would not happen, and that's led me to believe that Aristophanes is a complete and total fabrication. And when they tell the story and give you the whole thing of these shadows and the sun, they prove that the earth is a ball, when anybody who's looked into the flat earth knows clearly that a close sun would do the same thing as a faraway sun on a curved earth. So a close sun on a flat earth does the same thing. Yet again, it's just like the way they teach relativity. They tell their story and they say that it's fact and evidence, and if you've got something that even goes right in the face of it, they don't listen to it. They say, sorry, this is nope. They keep telling the story. They'll tell it for another 100 years if we let them. So hopefully we can change that. Did you want to cover up anything else before we bow out, or mention anything from your stuff?
You were talking about Greece, and I was say, you got to hear the story of Greece. Oh man, that's even worse than Rome or any of them. Basically, because where the Parthenon is built, before they discovered the Parthenon itself, there was an Ottoman fortress there, a medieval fortress there. And you can see this medieval fortress in the pictures if you just look up the history of Greece. And there are several pictures, and there's some pictures in the flamenco book as well. But there are a lot of pictures, and there's other pictures that show the construction of these supposedly ancient structures, and they're like in the 1800s. Mm-hmm. And there's also an Olympic game that they show, and it's a picture from I think 1860 something. In the background, you can see that there's still some castle towers standing where the Parthenon is. So that means that Greece, as we're being told, is not really that ancient.
No, I think we should do, it would be good to do a whole thing on Rome, because I do think it is true that all roads lead to Rome. That it certainly seems like they are behind everything. I mean, if you just look at Washington, D.C., and everything that goes on there. Everything seems to lead back to Rome with the doctrine of discovery and everything that they've put together. It certainly seems like they are in charge of the earth for whatever reason. But I think if we kind of do a history of that, maybe that would draw for people a better picture of why we are where we are. Because if you imagine that Rome did this conquering and the Inquisition, where they got rid of all the older books and they basically rewrote human history and put themselves in charge, and then made it look like they've been through a line of succession from Jesus dating back 2,000 years, when possibly they were the ones who killed him. And then the line of succession has only been around for a few hundred years, and then it starts to make better sense. So, I mean, I think that'd be a good show to do on Rome.
Right. Yeah, I agree. We can go more in depth with Rome and the real Rome, not the Italian Rome, because that's not
right.
Apparently, that wasn't even in existence in the 1400s, 1300s, and the 1400s. It may have been in existence, but it was a small town, according to Flamenco. It wasn't anything like what they say it is today.
Right.
So yeah, I would like to do a show on more in depth on Rome and Greece and Egypt and.
Yeah, Egypt would be awesome. I
go-
actually have a video that I've started but haven't done much on, but I think that that's an important topic too. And I saw the amount of people that flipped out at my Stonehenge video. And, you know, it's funny, as I'll bring this up actually right now, if I can find it. I just, let me see if I have it in here. I just saw this thing today, actually. Let me see if it's still up. Stonehenge map found. This Twitter account, let's see if I can find it. This Twitter account, it's a map place or something. They came across some documents from 18 something, and it's basically a layout for Stonehenge. It's just funny because what I was basically saying in my video was that once I found out that they had reconstructed Stonehenge, that it wasn't worth me even looking into anymore, because it just tells me that whatever they want it to be, they can make it. And they didn't leave it alone. If I ever found, if we found an ancient structure, it should be left alone. Not if you're going to pick up these blocks and put them back on top with cranes, and then tell children in school that we don't know how these big pieces of rock got on top of there. When you're like, yeah, you do. You put them up there with cranes. You know, and yeah, were they up there before? Who knows? I mean, but again, once they've been touched and changed and laid out and done differently. And it just doesn't make any sense with me when you look at okay, don't forget to answer moon phases in your model. Okay, thank you, Ramsey. I will talk about that in 1 second. But I think that once you know that they've been touched or tampered with, for me, I just don't put any faith in them. I don't think that they are, there's nothing telling me that that's an ancient structure that's been here forever, especially because they tell us in one sentence that there's this continental drift and the continents are moving a foot a year or something like that. But then over the course of 5,000 years, then that monument has moved a mile. So how can it be lined up to any stars anymore? And how could it be lined up to the sun, which they say it still is? And so there's just so many things wrong with it. And there's pictures of these guys building it and redoing it, and then they cement the blocks into the ground, and some of the blocks clearly are like plaster of Paris. Basically, they're like, just the outside. You can see the inside of the block is empty. So it just, to me, is like nothing. But this map that this guy found was basically it was a layout for it from 1850 something, and it was like laid out as like a Jewish star. Really weird. I can't find it right now. I'll have to. It was on Twitter, but I don't remember what the account was. Anyway, oh wait, I do remember, because I retweeted a map of. They showed a stupid map from NASA that was like, this is the map of the original universe, and it was just like a color. It was just colors. I was like, what the hell is this? So I made a joke to post my own version of it. Let me bring this up though real quick, because I want to. Let's see, which one is this? This one? Yeah, I just want to show these pictures. So 1 second, and yeah. So I mean, that I think would be great to do Rome, but the pyramids and that kind of those ancient structures, I think are are hugely important because, again, this is part of the whole story that I think they're trying to tell. So let's see, this is the British Library. Maybe I retweeted something else. I thought I retweeted from them, but it was called the map something. Map Monday, digital image of how the universe looked early to NASA. Oh, I'm not showing the screen. Let me show people this so they can laugh at this. This is hilarious. Let's see here. Get over this and this one. Okay, so, oops. What happened to my... I just erased my thing. Hold on, sorry. Okay, there we go. Now you should see it. All right, so this is the map right here. Isn't this funny? It says, digital image of how, according to NASA, the early universe looked. Matter began to clump into what would become galaxies. I know you can't see, but Clint, what it is a circle with pink and blue splotches. And NASA gets away with this, so it's like, what a joke. So I made a point to make my own.
Man.
It's like so funny. They get away with anything, man. It's just ridiculous. So I made my own and said, this is mine for people to see what mine looks like. I said, here's my picture of the early universe, guys. And it's just, I just took the circles and made them black. So there you go. That's better than your blue and pink, which I don't think is real. But there was this, God, I don't remember where this map was. I thought that it was from this same group, but I guess not, because this says the British Library, but it wasn't them. It was some map group. Maybe it was in there. No, I don't see it. All right, well, there was this map of the Stonehenge, and I don't know how I would find it. I can search and just see Stonehenge map, see if we find anything about that, because I just wanted to show. I mean, I thought it was interesting that they found that, and am I going to find it here? Yeah, it doesn't look like it. Such is my luck. Yeah, they had found this map on 3 different pieces of paper, but basically laying out the design for it, which is certainly interesting. Why is somebody laying out the design for Stonehenge in 1850 something? And again, people who laughed at me said, "Oh man, there's drawings of it from 1400. There's drawings from it from." And again, this all goes back to what people think is proof. Right. Like it's impossible to draw a picture of Stonehenge and date it to 1400. I mean, that's not proof of anything.
Yeah.
Yet,
well, especially since probably the 1400s wasn't even used as a date back then.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and that's what I was trying to find out with these books. It just didn't make any sense to me, and still doesn't, you know. So anyway, I'm going to go back to, let me see if I saved the image. Actually, I'll check that real quick. See if I saved it, because I might have. But certainly interesting, and I think if we do the same thing, I don't know how you feel about the pyramids, but I certainly have my huge doubts about them. Certainly the more research I do on that, it doesn't seem at all to be what they've told us.
Well,
do you think
there was a video? Well, I was going to say there was a video that someone had done. I'm not exactly sure who it was. I think his name was Dave something. But he did a video where he showed the layout of how pyramid, the Sphinx started.
Oh yeah, Dave
and
J.
these were drawings from the 1800s, I think.
Yeah, Dave J. did that. It's like one of the better videos he's ever done.
Yeah, and I saw that and I thought, wow, look at that. Look how they completely lied about the Sphinx and the
Well, too, it
pyramid.
looks like they carved them out of the, there was like mountains there, and they carved them out of the mountains. Like as if they were, it's not like they were built there or blocks were brought there. And there's a lot of interesting theories on that, too, that those blocks that are supposedly, tons of tons, they can just be the cast. And, the inside of there is, what's interesting is the Bible even says when Moses is talking to his people and they're enslaved by Egypt, that the Pharaoh makes them start gathering their own straw for bricks. And there's people who say that, that it's possible that those bricks are the outer casing of blocks, but the inside is straw. It's just so funny that you hear things like that and you're like,
no.
Has anyone ever looked into that?
Yeah, doubtful, because if those were made out of straw, they wouldn't. What it looks like is cement has been poured over certain areas of the pyramid.
And what would you think would be?
And that's what it looks like to me. Some really strong seamen, apparently. And, I could be wrong, but that's what it looks like.
Do you put a certain date on them? How old do you think they are?
I'm guessing maybe 1700s sometime. That's when they started.
Mm-hmm. And they were built with just manpower and.
Oh yeah. I'm guessing that.
I don't know if you've ever seen
cement had a lot. Yeah, cement had a lot to do with it, I think.
There's a video of a guy that has this whole idea of this counterweight system, and actually shows really good evidence for it. That basically you put one block on this thing and it kind of pulls up the other block from the other side by going down these shafts. And he actually showed where these tunnels are, where there's like a walkway now, but along the sides of the walkway are these scrape marks that match exactly what his idea is about this counterweight system. That was part of the video I was going to do because I've already got that video set up, so I'll have to do that because it was interesting. And I don't have that map I'm looking for, but anyway, it was a Twitter. I'll put it out when I find it eventually. Because I remember now you couldn't, for some reason I couldn't save it from Twitter. I was all pissed. But okay, so we will, let us know if there's something you guys want to have us cover. But I think it's definitely a book that I would recommend. And there's not a lot of books that I do recommend because a lot of books I get upset at when I read because for whatever reason. But so I don't recommend a lot of books. But and I'm somebody who skips and jumps and reads different portions. But with Fomenko's book, once I read number 1, I loved it, and I just haven't had time to read as much as I used to. But I've only gotten through like halfway of book 2. But he also has. Have you seen like the little cheat sheets he's got? Not cheat sheets, but they're like little short books. He has like a whole bunch of them. Like they're not part of the 7. They're not part of the series of 7. Let me make sure I'm showing my screen because then I'll go look right now. Yes, I'm showing it. I'll go look. There's like a series. There's a whole bunch of them. Let me see if it's what it's called. If you just look up Fomenko history, and let me see what they're called. So this new chronology. Here's the archive. Amazon. Let me go to Amazon. There's like a little bunch of, because I know here's the history, fiction, or science, and there's 1 through. I don't even know what the number. Do you know how many total there is? Is it 6 or 7?
Yeah, there's 7 of them.
7. Okay. And yeah. I thought that there was a bunch of, where did I see those? They're like a different color. They're almost a purple. Here we go. So these purple top ones here, like this one. So they're like little short stories. This one's called The Issue with Tsar's Helmet, History, Science, or Fiction, Book 13, Kindle edition. And usually there's like a whole bunch. Let me see down here. Yeah, see, these are, let me see how many there are. Looks like this is number 1, The Issue with Chronology. It might be like they're just broken down into shorter bits. But see, this is a great one. I just saw one here. This one's called Book 2, Astronomy versus History. I would love to read that. This one's The Apocalypse is Seen by Astronomy. Number 4 is Dark Ages in Medieval History. Number 5 is The Issue with Antiquity. Number 6 is The Issue with Troy. 7 is The Issue with Russian History. 8 is The Horde from Pacific to Atlantic. 9 is The Issue with the Mongols. 10 is The Issue with Ivan the Terrible. 11, The Issue with Tamerlane. 12, the USA has issues with British maps. That's an interesting thing. I read that in book 2, I think, where, it's talking about that it looks like Russia had control of the North.
Pugachev had control of the United States back in 1776, I believe.
See, that's crazy because that's a whole different history of our own country. People would be really interested in that. I didn't get into it too deep, but yeah, basically when you look at the maps and things, the Europeans didn't have any knowledge of anything about Canada or the northern parts of the United States when they should have. The map should match, considering they should have data on that, but it almost is like they weren't allowed to go there, or the ancient Indians didn't seem to be there either. So it's an interesting story. Then we've got the issue with Great Tartary. That's 14. The issue with Great Britain, the Crusades and the Exodus. And I recommend reading one of these because when you read one, you'll be addicted. You'll see what I'm talking about the amount of research that's being done. It's not just, here's a new way to look at it. It's here's why what we've been told is wrong. Here's the evidence that it's wrong. here's the evidence that these other parts could be the actual truth. And it's hard to argue with it. And it's kind of crazy. It's funny because he's a big name in the Academy of Science and stuff, and the Russian Federation. It's funny because you would think he would get blackballed for that kind of information, and he has been somewhat. I just saw in his Wikipedia it says that he's the founder of the pseudoscience of the new chronology or something, but the rest of the Wikipedia article is generally positive.
Yeah, pseudoscience, that's what they call it now.
Yeah, pseudoscience, yeah.
Or pseudoscience and pseudo-history.
Right, pseudo-history. And it says the Great Wall of China hoax. Have you heard, what does he have to say about that?
1950 was when it was supposedly built or finished.
Wow.
I think it was finished in 1950.
Yeah, so people will enjoy that stuff. I mean, it's really interesting. And again, if you read it and it doesn't jive with your ideas, or you research and find something different, then so be it.
Right. Another thing he mentions, though, is he does mention the flat Earth, but he mentions that some guy named Cosmos
Endopolitis.
Yes. He believed the universe was a box. The center contained the flat Earth. Well, he also mentioned that on page 373 in Chronicles 1.
Mm-hmm.
So that was interesting when I read that. I thought, wow, why would he mention that when he's talking about Sir Isaac Newton? Or he does talk about Sir Isaac Newton, but it's briefly. But I don't know what he believes.
I think I don't know either, but I know that he talks about him in a positive way because he went against the chronology of what's his name? So the Scaligerian chronology.
Scaligerian chronology, yeah, Joseph
Right.
Scaliger, yeah.
Yeah, that Newton was one of the ones at the time, because at the time he was kind of getting free run of the place, and Newton was one that was stepping up and saying that his timeline was wrong. I've never seen anything tell me what Newton's idea of the timeline was, but I think Newton was kind of out of his brain anyway. And I've also heard things that he wasn't even real anyway, so I mean, I don't know. It's hard to know these things, you know. Well,
Kind of like Shakespeare.
Well, it's just funny. I've heard people describe him as like, he was the savior that came along. Well, he was born on Christmas. He was born December 25th, like the Savior Jesus. And the fact that his name is Isaac, and, Isaac was the sacrifice of Abraham, and the apple falling on his head was the equivalent of the fall of man and the apple in the garden. And there was just a bunch of correlations that they were, Newton, the whole idea of a Newton. I don't know. It was interesting that the connections that they drew. And for me, I've been doing so much research. I have a video coming out right after this one where I talk a little bit about some issues with the book Jules Verne wrote, From Earth to the Moon, and the fact that it matches so correctly with the event that happened 100 years after that. And also, if people haven't heard of the book The Titan, which was a book that came out many years before the Titanic, describing the exact same thing. Almost, it's uncanny. And I've always had this belief that I think that these guys who run the world are not creative. They can't come up with things on their own, so they constantly copy whatever's in is the go. Either authors or it's just like when Arthur C. Clarke submitted his letter to the editor about satellites, and then within 15 years, NASA had satellites. And same thing with Jules Verne. Jules Verne talked about sending people to the moon. This is 1865. He wrote that book, and it would be 3 people, and that they would go around the moon, and that they would come back and land in the Pacific Ocean near Hawaii, and that they would leave on in December, and that there would be, and this is 1865, that the first people that would go to the moon would be Americans, and that there would be a competition between Florida and Texas for which state would get to launch the astronauts from, and Florida won, and the place that they launched them is like 120 miles from where NASA launches their astronauts now. Just uncanny.
Interesting.
You almost have to believe either Jules Verne saw the future or NASA simply copied his book for their story. You can decide which one you think is more likely the truth. But so it seems like a lot of these things are almost like when I hear things like that, I'm like, man, some things are just too coincidental. But again, I think also you can draw correlations. But yeah, if you ever look up the whole idea of the Titan, even worse than the two I just described, the Titan was unbelievable. The story that was told 15 years prior by a Freemason, talking about this boat, the Titan, which was the largest and most unsinkable boat in the world, and it was traveling across the Atlantic and hit an iceberg. Crazy. It's just absolutely like they just copied it word for word and made it into reality. So something that I think happens, and I chalk it up to they don't have very much creativity. And that Cosmos Endopolitus, I was trying to find his, I don't know how to spell his name. Endopolitus.
INDICOPLEE.
Oh, is it INDOUSTES? Endopolitus. I don't know, I'm not even getting close. And neither's, oh, thanks. Google just gave me no results. When the hell does that ever happen? I think it was E. Do you remember the name of the book that it was? Cosmos Endopolitus?
INDICOPLEUSTES.
Cosmos. Let me put Cosmos Flat Earth. That'll come up. Yeah, he thought that the description of the Ark of the Covenant was the Earth, I think is how he describes it. The box, which is the Ark of the Covenant.
Oh, right.
And then God describes it in the Bible, and I think he takes that and draws from that. Gosh darn it, why is that not coming up? Cosmos Endo. Yeah, but that's actually a funny book. It's one of the first books I read when I was looking into Flat Earth, and I don't know why this thing will not come up. That's really weird. Cosmos Endopolitus. I don't see it. But in the book, he actually makes some really funny jokes at people who believe in antipodes and people that are upside down, and just kind of curses them out because he thinks that they're ridiculous. And I know that book's on my site, so I can actually probably just do that and be easier. And you guys can check that book out. It's definitely worth the read. But he was and I think that book is supposedly, it's one of the same things, same issue though, that it was written by him supposedly in 500 or 600, but didn't come around till 1100 or something that they found it, or that it can be dated back to. But I'll see.
The Middle Ages.
Yeah, Middle Ages, which certainly seems interesting. So what would you say, just so we can close it out? I mean, what do you think is the whole underlying thing here? Do you think it's a matter of something happened and that our history is really shorter than it is, or that they've tried to cover things up by placing things over the real history? What do you feel it is?
That's an interesting question. There's things that have been found that are called OOPArts, out of place artifacts.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you can contribute that to what may be going on, but it's hard to say. What if we had a civilization that did have advanced ancient technology at one point and something happened? Something similar to the meteorite or whatever event that happened in England in the Middle Ages. If it was something similar to that all over the world, then it kind of makes sense that the history would we wouldn't have anything to document that,
mm-hmm.
and there wouldn't be anything that such as a manuscript or something that documented that. And that's what the problem is with the Dark Ages. We don't have anything reliable that'll tell us anything about the Dark Ages or the BC time frame. We have, some books from historians who possibly lived or supposedly lived in the BC time frame, like Titus Livy and Tacticus and, those other historians. But there's nothing to tell us, if they didn't exist then and they existed in the Middle Ages, there's nothing to tell us what happened before the 11th or the even the 10th century AD. We don't really know. And that might be what they're hiding. It might be something they are hiding. Maybe we did have advanced technology at one time and something happened. You know, I don't think it's plausible to believe that man, we came up with what we have now as far as technology within 200 years. That's about a 200-year time frame. And they want us to believe that, well, they created the wheel and then that was all they created, and they put it on wagons, and they used it for wagons for many centuries, and that was pretty much the height of technology. It doesn't make any sense. And for me, you know, in my opinion, I think maybe there was some kind of advanced civilization or something similar to that existed before, possibly. I mean, who's to say? You know, who knows? And that might be why the out-of-place artifacts.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely in the same belief that it kind of gets confused because people hear me talk about both, but I think that the current people that are here, and I don't mean, obviously we're all less than 110 years old, but I mean, this age, if you want to call it that, or this eon, or this era, or whatever, I think is relatively short. But that doesn't mean I think that there could be civilizations that went back far beyond this. But I think that there's either an event or some, I don't know who does it, or if people are all killed somehow, or that they kind of wipe humanity. And it makes me think of things like the Georgia Guidestones that seem to be telling what to do if that happens again, you know, keep humanity to this number. Not saying I agree with them, just saying it's certainly interesting that somebody would go through all that work to put up the Georgia Guidestones, which, by the way, I should have brought that up when talking to Orphan Red about the North Star, because they also drilled a hole right through the center looking right at the North Star, which if they knew it moved, then that wouldn't be a very smart move because it won't be there for long. But it certainly seems like the North Star remains. And but when I look at it, I always call it like a reset event. I don't like to be doom and gloom at all, but I think that sometimes I think that they might have something planned where if they were to get rid of most of the people living now and they were to be underground when they did so, they would be able to pop back out and do this all again with the same books and the same stories and the same nonsense, and even be able to clean up based on things that, you know, people like us are going around and saying and making videos about what's wrong with the globe model. Then maybe they just come back with a better model and try to enslave people again. So I know it sounds crazy, but like you said, there's artifacts for sure when you dig deep, and we just don't ever dig deep. I mean, think about wherever you're at right now. What's a mile below your feet? You know, I mean, you wouldn't have a clue.
Right.
But if there was a flood or some sort of disaster, the pile, it would pile up on top, and it would be buried below us. We wouldn't be able to see it. And there's tons of stories of Atlantis and Lemuria and places like that going down. Whether those are just stories or not, I don't know. But the name of that book was Christian Topography, if you're looking for it. Don't get it from my side. I just tried, and it said there was an error with the file, so I'll try and clean that up. But it's a great book to read. It's really funny. And it's supposedly written, I know the book says 1895, I think, but when he was supposedly wrote it, I think was something like 400, 500, 600 is what they say. But it certainly seems like it's written back then, and he just laughs at people that could possibly ever think that there is any kind of people living underneath you. And I find that funny because I also am in that same belief that I don't think anybody is upside down underneath me. I think that the sea level is sea level because it's level, and that there's mountains and peaks and valleys, but I don't see a ball. I don't believe in that. So any final words? And like I said, everybody, if you appreciate Clint coming on, and if anybody else wants to join us and talk history, or if you guys have ideas for topics or want to see us do Rome, please leave a comment. It helps me know what you enjoy and what you don't. And any final words there?
I think Troy would be another one we could go into.
I think so too. That'd be good. Yeah, there's so many topics when you talk about history, especially you even using Fomenko as a starting point. Reading his stuff really gave me a whole new look on things. So wasn't able to bring up a lot from memory today, but whatever the topic will be, then I can at least make sure I have some stuff to say about that topic, and we'll keep the show shorter. So then rather than go 3 hours, because people always tell, that's one thing they always tell me, and I haven't done a good job of that, is my shows are too long. I talk too much. I say the same thing over and over again. And what else do they say? That's about it.
Yeah, but there's so much information,
There is. It's tough.
There's a lot to cover, so you have to. It's hard to put it all in one show. And
yeah, it is. I mean, I do like doing these live shows. I really do. But I also like making videos because you're able to do a better job of trying to get a bunch of information at least into a compact. My compact videos are 45 minutes, but at least it feels like you're able to round it off. Sometimes in these live things, I'm done, and then I think of a million things after, like, I wanted to say that. So, any final words before we head on out?
I believe that's everything. Thank you all for joining us. And
all right, guys, be good, be kind.
Really appreciate it.
Don't lie to each other, and open your mind, because there's truth inside. Till next time, this has been Jeranism. Peace! Called the Scaligerian chronology, which if people don't know what that is, we'll tell you here shortly, but it's kind of the chronology that we all go by now. And then we're going to get into some of the church history, the Roman history, talking about why that doesn't work and what we think possibly is the reason for that. We want to get into the Crusades and talk about that and what year that supposedly happened versus what year it probably happened. We want to talk about Jerusalem and the problems with modern day Jerusalem, and then get into English history and why the Anglo-Saxon chronicles seem to only date back to 400 years ago or so. So we'll kind of cover that all, and if it's something that you guys want us to cover more of, we can do that. But today will just be kind of a topical, but at the same time we'll get through it. I did have a couple quotes just about history to read real quick. Of course, the one that I'm sure everyone has at some time or another heard, which is, one second, make sure you're reading the same screen I am, is the one from Napoleon Bonaparte, which says, history is a set of lies agreed upon. And if you just think about that, that is probably very true. This one here is interesting. It's history is a lie. Religion is a control system. Money is a hoax. Debt is a fiction. Media is manipulation. Government is a corporation, and the system is a lie. Many people have also heard the Adolf Hitler quote, make the lie big, make it simple, keep saying it, and eventually they will believe it. And also, finally, we have Mark Twain, who said, history is strewn thick with evidence that a truth is not hard to kill, but a lie, well told, is immortal. And that's, one of my favorite quotes about history. Before we get too much into that, I just wanted to ask you, are you also a believer, or have you been looking into the shape of the earth? Are you a believer in the flat earth theory? Are you a globe skeptic?
Oh, yeah. My flat earth interest started about 5-6 years ago, and I found Matt Boylan's website, where he talks about how he was once working for NASA. And, I watched his videos and I thought, wow, this makes a lot of sense. And I had questioned everything else up to that point except that. But then after he proved that you could, make a painting and you really can't tell the difference between a painting and a photo, that really struck me. And I think that's really what got me started with watching flat earth videos and going along with a lot of the interests and concerns of the flat earth movement.
Yeah, and I think anybody who, a lot of people ask me all the time, what's your number one reason the Earth is flat. And I always say it's my whole entire video selection, or it's my whole entire body of research that has led me to that. And one of the main things is the idea of history. So if you haven't looked into history yet, then it's no surprise to me that you would have issues with the idea of a flat Earth, because if history is as we're told, well, then there's not a lot of questions about the shape of the Earth. The problem becomes if we've got books that have been rewritten in 1600, and we've got timelines that have been redrawn in 1600, and we've kind of got a reorganizing of thoughts and a reorganizing of minds, and on top of that, we've got the installation of the type press, or being able to mass produce books. And when you combine all that together, all of a sudden it kind of can tell you why something the size of what we've been talking about in the flat Earth world is certainly possible. Because when you've gotten books that have all been rewritten and you've been able to mass produce them, really it's about getting that through to one generation, getting the new story out to one group of people, and they become your teachers, and then they become the professors, and you've kind of in one fatal swoop introduced this lie to the world. And that's what really, when we get into this, you'll see how it's highly possible. And there's not a lot that we can go on as far as our history. And a lot of people think that history is pretty much set in stone, and we'll also go through some of that. There's so much dissension in the ranks and disagreements about everything in history because it's such a disaster. It's such a mess. It's hard to follow. People show up numerous times in history. There's also references to people at the wrong time, people who are referencing people in books that are dead, people, not mentioning others that they absolutely should. One of those I've talked a lot about is Aristophanes, who was from Alexandria. He was supposedly the librarian there. And there's people that came after, there's people that came after him that were from the same city and talking about the same subjects that never mention his name once. And those kind of things are impossible. Those things just would not happen. And so that's why I'm able to just dismiss stories like the Aristophanes story. And a lot of it just doesn't make sense. And so we're going to talk about that. To start out, why don't you kind of give people an idea of what the Scaligerian chronology is? And I'll kind of bring that up on a website here so we can kind of show it.
Okay. So Josephus Justus Scaliger, who lived from 1440 to 1609, and he was called the founder of modern chronology. His principal works are the Opus Novium de Imitationem, I really can't pronounce that, Temporum, and that was Paris of 1583, the Sacrum Temporum, which was 1606, and the De Doctrina Temporum, Paris.
Astronauts to the moon.
Ignition sequence start. 3, 2, 1.
Houston, we have a problem.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue.
What you're seeing here is a mirage.
What's going on, everyone? It's Jeranism back with a live video for you today. Thanks, as always, for joining me. I appreciate it a ton. Hello to everyone in the chat. Hello to those at home or in your car or wherever you might be. Grab a seat, get comfortable. It's time to talk about our history. So an interesting subject for sure, but also a very sensitive one and one of huge importance. So one thing that I've found very interesting about this subject is it's so sensitive that people often get very upset when you question it. And so I just wanted to remind everybody listening to please have an open mind. Please don't dismiss things right off the bat. You need to do your own research. You need to look into what we're saying. You need to do your own back fact checking. But it's also something that needs to be questioned, because even if you look as early as, say, 1850, Anything that came out of Washington as news would simply be whatever they told the guy on the horse to ride back and tell everybody else. So it would have been very easy to fabricate our history at many points throughout time. And if you look at just what's happened recently, that with the media being controlled and owned, that it's very easy for them even now to fabricate our history. So just keep an open mind. It is definitely going to be a shocking little conversation. Joining me today is Clint Wayland. And Clint, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm here.
Good. And I'm just going to double check and make sure that everyone can hear me okay. So if somebody in the chat can just give me a okay that you can hear us both before I can continue on and make a mockery of you guys not being able to hear me. So we're going to make sure that that's all heard, and then we'll get going. Let's see here. Let's make sure everyone can hear us both. I don't see anything yet, but should be here soon. Usually it's about 15 seconds behind or so. But we won't move on until we get an okay. And anybody, do we sound good? Can you hear us both? Well, I guess that's probably a yes. Good sound. All right. Thank you, Jason. Appreciate that. Okay, good. Glad you guys can hear us okay. And Clint, why don't you tell me or tell everybody, and I'll just say how we met real quick. We have exchanged emails a few times, and that probably started, 2 years ago. And you'd heard me talk about my opinions of history, and you had the same kind of opinions. And then also we found out that both of us were reading, or I think you had read it, and I was in the middle of reading Antoni Fomenko's work. It's called The New Chronology. He's got quite a few books. I think it's a 7-book set or 6-book set. I'll show that here in a second for everyone to see. But
Right.
Why don't you just tell everybody, how you've come into this information and what your opinion is of history.
Sure. Okay, well, it was about 2 years ago, and like I said, I emailed you regarding the history, and a little bit about me is, I'm from Oklahoma, small town Oklahoma, and ever since I was about 11 years old, I've questioned history. I've looked into history. I've been studying medieval history since about 11 years old. In fact, when I was 11, I checked out a book that was meant for a high school grade level that was about the Crusades, and so I've been researching that material for many years. And what I've come across is that history doesn't seem logical, and it doesn't match what we look at today. It doesn't seem to correspond with the natural flow of what history really should be. And if anything didn't make any sense to me, I always questioned it. And so basically I started questioning history, and then I grew up, went to college, but my research didn't stop. I still continued to research the medieval history and history of not just the medieval history, but the history of England, history of Rome, the Crusades, and church history as well.
Good, yeah, and I've kind of looked into some of the same things, and people know my story as far as selling books, and that's what really got me on my, look into history and when these books were written and who wrote them and why they were all rewritten. Where's the originals? Where's the... and I think Fomenko believes that the oldest verifiable text that we can, go to is about 1100. Is that what he says?
I believe so, yeah. You can't go back any further than that. Although he did mention the 3 codices of the Old Testament, the Bible, that go back to the 9th century. But other than that, there's no other manuscripts that he mentions or codices that he mentions that goes back any further than that.
Correct. Yeah, and what we want to do is we're going to kind of step through this, starting off with the
16th and 17th century, whenever Joseph Scaliger wrote his chronology. So basically that means that anything that he wrote about, the history that he wrote about, was written in the 16th and 17th century.
Right. And so let's get into the second stuff. The second thing we wanted to talk about. So go ahead and start with that history, and we'll go back where you want to go back to. Greek and Roman times.
Sure. Well, Rome has a lot of problems. The one question that most historians have problems with is who founded Rome. Was it Aeneas, or what? Aeneas and Ulysses, or was it Remus and Romulus? And Aristotle claims that the city of Rome was founded by Aeneas and Ulysses, and received its name from the Trojan woman Rama. Okay, but Titus Livy wrote History of Rome, and he said that it was founded by Romulus and Remus. So that's just one problem that we've got with Rome. And it was founded in 753 BC, supposedly. And that's according to the Scaligerian timeline.
Right.
Then we got Titus Livy. This is another problem, who wrote the history of Rome and described Rome and its history, a whole 700-year period. But only 35 books survived of the original 144 books.
Mm-hmm.
The first publication of his history took place in 1469 and was based on a manuscript of unknown origin, which is currently lost. So that's the second problem. And then we've got the medieval historian Ferdinand Gregorovius, who says that Rome, when he supposedly visited Rome in the 15th century, and when he did, he said that it transformed into a monastery.
Mm-hmm.
He also said that the imperial forums have drowned into taciturnity. He says that the Forum of Augustus was encumbered with ruins to such an extent that it had many trees growing there. The trees were so many that the people used to call it the Enchanted Garden. This is Italian Rome we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Where with all of the monuments and the columns and the structures. Ferdinand Gregorovius says that the capital city had grown over with weeds so that the ruins were barely visible. And basically what Anatoly Fomenko says, the reason for that is because the ruins hadn't been built yet. There was nothing there.
Mm-hmm.
So Gregorovius stated that not a single monument of any Roman celebrity from the first part of the 13th century remained in Rome. He says the enormous ruins of the forums built by Augustus, Nerva, and Caesar have miraculously transformed into castle fortresses.
Right.
He writes that there is no proof that the castle fortresses had stood there for many centuries. And so basically what happened is when these people read Joseph Scaliger's History of Rome, they thought, and since he put that history in current modern day Italy, Rome, Italy, they thought that they would find everything that he mentioned for Rome when they visited Rome. But they didn't. They didn't find anything.
Right.
There was no paper in antiquity, as we are told nowadays. The classics, of anything that was written down from that time frame, there was nothing. They couldn't find any books or anything in Rome when he visited. There was nothing there, and so then there's the problem of Tacitus. The history of Scaligerian chronology, the books of Tacitus, disappeared from sight for a long time, fell into oblivion. but they resurfaced again in the 14th and the 15th century,
Right.
miraculously.
And we're missing for
And
hundreds of years.
Right. And these, like I said, this is Titus Livy and Tacitus we're talking about. These were the writers of the history of Rome.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they were the ones. That's how we know about the Roman history.
Right.
Without these writers, we wouldn't know anything about the Roman history. Another writer is Plutarch. Plutarch was basically he was kind of a historian, but he was discovered by Francisco Petrarch, who sounds very similar to Plutarch. And Francisco Petrarch lived from 1304 to 1374. And Petrarch, when he visited Rome, was convinced that there should be many great buildings of ancient times in Rome, but he didn't find any.
Mm-hmm.
Just like Gregorovius, he couldn't find any building or monuments. Petrarch writes, "Where are the thermodialectican Caracalla? Where is the Timbrium of Marius, the Septizonium of Service? Where is the Forum of Augustus, the Temple of Mars, the Avenger? Where are the places of Jupiter, the Thunder Barrier, on the Capitol and Apollo, or the Capitol and Apollo of the Palatine? Where is the Portico of Libya and the Theater of Marcellus? Where are the temples of Hercules and the Muses built by Marius Philip, and the Temple of Diana built by Lucius Cornelius?" See, these are really popular structures that should have been there.
Right.
But none of these were there when he visited Italian Rome. And so he searched for statues, collected Roman medals, and tried to recreate the history of Rome again, because there was no history.
And what year is
Petrarch,
that? What year is that he went in searching for those things?
That was in the 14th century, sometime around the 1370s.
Right.
He died in the 1370s. That was probably around 1350 something. So, but yeah, he visited Rome and there was nothing there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the same thing goes with Gregorovius when he visited Rome, and that was in the 15th century as well. That was about 100 years later, but still he didn't find anything. And so then you read about the next problem we have is the papal secretary Poggio Bracciolini. He received an inventory of a number of manuscripts that contains several minor works of Tacitus from a monk from Hursfield Abbey. Now we're told that he had the collection of all of the books of Tacitus and Titus Livy, and so, but problem is, where did he get those books? And he lived in 1425, so where did he come up with these books?
Mm-hmm.
If they were non-existent before? And so some authors named Hocart and Rose proclaim the history of Cornelius Tacitus to have actually been written in the 15th century, and they claim that Poggio Bracciolini wrote the history or forged it. Now, the reason they did is because he had a history of forgery, and there were some other manuscripts that he had forged that he'd been caught forging.
Right.
So that's another problem that we have with Rome, and that's a huge problem. To say that the letters and the history of Titus Livy and Tacitus were possibly forged. And then we got Plutarch, who was also a writer of Rome and the history of Rome, but the person who had his book, or had one of his books in collection, was a man named Francisco Petrarch, who sounds just like, if you put an L and a U in front of the name, you get Plutarch.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Petrarch was in the possession of a list of original works by Horace, Ovid, Catullus, Propertius, Tibullus, Perseus, Claudian, Ovid, comedians Plautus and Tertullius, the historians Titus Livy, Silistius, Eutropius, Justin, Valerius, Maximus, Quintilian, Varro, Pliny, Vitruvius. There's a whole list of these books that he had in his possession, and Plutarch. So, and he also had scribes working for him. He founded a workshop with scribes and secretaries. And according to some of the letters, Cicero, according to some of these letters that he had in his possession, Cicero was a knight and a troubadour.
Mm-hmm.
That makes him medieval, not Roman.
Right. Maybe we could talk. Maybe we could talk about some, figures that people might know of or have heard of that don't fit in the timeline that that they've been placed. I know I've done a lot of looking into Josephus's work from Antiquities of the Jews, and many people know about the Jesus input, which certainly seems like it's been placed into that writing, because if you just kind of read the Antiquities of the Jews, you'll see how detailed he is. Now, one of the interesting things is there that they never use dates, which has always bothered me. Because if you asked me to write you a story, I would write a story, and I probably wouldn't include any dates. But if you told me to write a history of my life, or a history of the last week, or what I did today, well, I'm going to have dates. That's how you write true history. So I've always found it a little bit weird that usually they'll describe it around the time of so-and-so, when so-and-so was in charge and was married to, that's how they describe it, which could have been that simply, hey, thank you, IPS. It could be simply that people back then didn't, go off the dates. They went more off of who was in charge. But I think also we would have a lot of instances of dates being input. So if people don't know, I'll just show you. This is in chapter, I believe it's book 20. I don't even know what book I'm in here. It's in book, what are we at? Book 18. And this is of Josephus's work, and just show you where the Jesus line is put in. You'll have a lot of people who will say this is proof.
Paris, 1627. And then it's believed that the foundations of what he discovered and his chronology were laid by Eusebius, Pamphilus, and Saint Hymenaeus. I'm not going to pronounce that right. Honymus.
Thank you, Time.
Allegedly in the 4th century.
Yeah.
Honymus.
Something interesting just from the right when you get to his Wikipedia. It says, was a French religious leader and scholar known for expanding the notion of classical history from Greek and ancient Roman history to include Persian, Babylonian, Jewish, and ancient Egyptian history. So, I mean, that right there is something that people need to look at, and that should call into question, like, what are you talking about? What do you mean he's known for expanding the notion of classical history? And so we'll talk about that, but go ahead and continue on from there.
Okay, well, Joseph Scaliger got the information that he used from Eusebius, and Eusebius of Caesarea, he was basically the one who put together a chronology based on the dating of Genesis in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And this dating, or since Adam, actually. And so what you've got here is the problem that every nation had their own dating of the time from the dating of the history of Genesis, and so basically they thought, well, some of them thought it was 5489. One of them thought maybe it was 6403, and these dates were basically what he used to date the history. And that's where we get the problems, is because these dates are way off, and they probably didn't even, have anything to do with real history. And so Eusebius published his works in 1544, or his works were published in 1544. And it's assumed that the Scaligerian chronology was based on the interpretations of the assorted numeric data that was collected from the Bible. And then, so Joseph Scaliger attempted to reconstruct the entire tractate of Eusebius. And so that's where basically the problems come from. And then there's other problems, such as the fact that most of the history that we know of, the dating of our current calendar, is based off a particular ruler, or it could be based off of a time that the founding of a specific city was founded, or a date. So, in other words, like if it wasn't a Christian country which used the dating for the Genesis, which Joseph Scaliger used, then they probably went by the founding of their city, or the founding of the ruler when that ruler was born. They didn't have a specific. They didn't all use the same dating system. And an example of that is Russia. Russia right now doesn't use, or they hadn't used for a long time, the calendar, the Julian calendar. So that's kind of a history of Joseph Scaliger and how he came up with some of his dating methods.
Right, and one thing that I always like to point out is just to really think about, if we were to, at this point in history, or at this point in life, go back in time and to set a zero date to a certain point, that a lot of that should call into question exactly what went on. Just to think of that we went back in time, set a zero date, and said anything before that we're going to count negative, anything after that we're going to count positive. It's just not something that would be done, especially as late as they did it. It's just something that sounds crazy. And again, I went looking for books written by Ptolemy, and these are the guys I wanted to see, when did they write this stuff. And when I went looking, you can't find the date that they actually wrote it. Now, you can find the date that coincides with our current dating system, but I was looking for, when did they say they wrote it? Because if Ptolemy wrote it in 70 AD or whatever, then he must have written what the date was according to him. And a lot of these books, that has been eliminated. It's been rewritten and applied to our current dating system. And that was something that made me get real upset, because I said, well, how do we know any of this stuff is dated correctly? Somebody could have just dated this. And really, when you start looking through some of the writings, Lucretius and other people like that, they were writing way ahead of their time. If we're supposed to believe that stuff, then we also have to believe that humans are just stupid as it gets. Basically, he's giving the answers to different things like atoms and how things work, and how things are made up. And this was 1800 years before some of these things were even started to come out in
materialize.
Yeah. So I mean, it's ridiculous. And same thing when we go with Da Vinci and things like that. That he's drawing things that took him 400 or 500 years even to begin thinking about. It just doesn't work when you look at our history. So with the Scaliger dating, what year did they, or around what time did they apply that? And was it universal? Was it something that was picked up by everyone quickly, or how do you see that?
Well, his books, or his works, were written in 1583, 1606, 1627. So it was the